The operating room had 17 people in it, monitors screaming, blood pooling faster than anyone could suction it. A man dying on the table while 3 surgeons argued about why. And, in the back corner, a quiet nurse in navy scrubs raised her hand and said, "The vessel is displaced, calmly, clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear." Nobody turned around. The chief surgeon kept cutting. 40 seconds later, the hemorrhage became catastrophic. The same nurse pushed through the circle, cleared the field with her bare hands, and exposed the exact artery she had warned them about. The surgeon clamped it. The man lived. Then security escorted her out of the building. Before we go, if you've never been here before, if you've hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that make your jaw drop actually get told from start to finish. Give this video a like if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go back to the beginning. Lenox Valley Regional Medical Center sat at the edge of a mid-sized city in central Ohio that had never made national news for anything good. The hospital was functional, the way a lot of institutions are functional, not broken enough to fix, not whole enough to trust. It had 3 floors, 2 trauma bays, a surgical wing that smelled like recycled air and old paint, and a nursing staff that worked 12-hour shifts and were thanked approximately never. The parking lot lights buzzed from dusk to dawn. The vending machine on the 2nd floor had been broken for 4 months, and nobody had filed the right form to get it repaired. The tile in the main corridor had a hairline crack running from the elevator doors to the nursing station that everyone stepped over every day without looking down. It was that kind of place. Functional, unremarkable. The kind of institution that keeps a city alive without anyone in that city thinking too hard about how. Sela Vance had been working the overnight rotation there for 14 months. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and built lean in the way that comes from years of carrying weight across distances that have no comfortable measurement. She had dark circles that never fully went away, hands that moved with a precision that looked rehearsed but wasn't, and a habit of standing slightly apart from a group not antisocial, just observational. Tactical, if you knew the word for it. Most people at Lenox Valley didn't know the word for it. Because most people at Lenox Valley hadn't spent any meaningful time trying to figure out who Sela Vance actually was. She wore navy scrubs. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight. She answered questions directly and without elaboration completed her charts ahead of schedule, never called in sick, and did not make small talk in the break room unless someone addressed her first. The other nurses liked her in the abstract way. You like someone you don't really know. She was reliable. She wasn't dramatic. She covered shifts when the board was short. The doctors barely registered her existence at all. She was overnight staff. She was background. She had been a combat medic in the United States Army for 6 years. She had deployed 3 times twice to the same region in the span of 18 months, once somewhere she still didn't talk about. She had treated injuries in forward surgical units under conditions that no hospital in Ohio would have recognized as medical care. Working by headlamp, working in heat, working when the nearest backup was 40 minutes by helicopter, and the patient had maybe 15. She had kept people alive with her hands and her training and the specific, ruthless clarity that comes from environments where hesitation and death are the same thing. She had never mentioned any of this to anyone at Lenox Valley. Not because she was ashamed of it, because nobody had asked, and she was not in the habit of offering information that hadn't been requested. The night Marcus Doyle came through the trauma bay was a Tuesday in late October, which meant the overnight shift was already running short 2 nurses out, 1 float covering 2 assignments, and the charge nurse, a woman named Donna Peretti, moving through the floor with the focused displeasure of someone who had asked for staffing support 3 times and been told it was being evaluated. Sela had been at Lenox Valley long enough to know that being evaluated meant no, delivered slowly. She had already handled a broken IV pump, a patient in Bay 2 who had pulled his own catheter and then been aggressively apologetic about it, and a 15-minute conversation with Donna about restocking Bay 3, which was Sela's responsibility on overnights, and which she had already restocked and then had to restock again. After an earlier shift left it depleted. She did not point this out. She restocked it again and went back to her assigned patients. Doyle arrived by ambulance at 9:47 p.m. He was a 53-year-old construction foreman with a broad build and calloused hands and the particular look of a man who had been told all his life that he was too solid to be seriously hurt. Pressurized fitting on a late-running project had blown and caught him hard across the upper abdomen. Paramedics had him borderline stable on arrival blood pressure sitting at 94/60, which sounds close enough to acceptable until you understand that it's trending, and trending matters more than the number itself. The lead paramedic gave the report. The intake resident logged it. The attending on call, a hospitalist named Dr. Farrow, reviewed the numbers, ordered an abdominal ultrasound, and reached for his phone to call upstairs. His expression throughout was the carefully neutral expression of a physician who has correctly identified that this patient belongs to someone else. Sela was not assigned to Bay 3. She was assigned to Bay 1, where a 71-year-old woman named Patricia Ullman was recovering from a hip procedure and asking, at intervals of approximately 12 minutes, whether her son had called. Sela had checked the messaging system twice and given Patricia the honest answer both times, which was that no calls had come in yet. Patricia would have preferred a softer version of that answer, and some of the other nurses would have given her one. Sela didn't see the point in softening something that was just going to need unsoftening later. She could see Bay 3 from where she stood at the foot of Patricia's bed, and she watched Marcus Doyle without being obvious about it, which was a skill she had developed in environments where obvious observation was a liability. His pressure was dropping, not dramatically, not at a rate that would immediately alarm the monitors, but dropping in a pattern she recognized slow, steady, the kind of loss that is quiet right up until it isn't. His skin had gone slightly gray in a distribution that didn't track with simple abdominal contusion. He kept trying to shift his position, not from restlessness, but from the involuntary movement of a body that is trying to find a less painful arrangement and not finding one. His abdomen, when the resident palpated it during the initial assessment, produced a rigidity that was wrong for the reported mechanism. She watched. She cataloged. She didn't say anything yet because she hadn't finished processing what she was seeing, and she had learned the hard way that speaking before you're certain of what you're saying is worse than not speaking at all. Dr. Callum Regan arrived 11 minutes after the page. He was the chief of surgery at Lennox Valley, 9 years in the position, the kind of tenure that becomes its own argument for itself. By any fair measure, his surgical record was solid. His technique was precise, and his outcomes tracked well against regional data, and he had the kind of patient-facing experience that families that found reassuring in the 45-minute window of a surgical consultation. He was not an incompetent surgeon. He was something more specific, and in some ways more dangerous than that. He was a surgeon who had never been wrong out loud. 9 years of it being the ceiling of a room will do that. It doesn't happen consciously. It doesn't require any particular act of arrogance. It just requires that nobody ever make you feel the cost of not listening. And over time, that absence calcifies into something structural, a habit of certainty that does not distinguish between domains where certainty is earned and domains where it isn't. He reviewed Doyle's chart. He looked at the ultrasound image on the portable display with the focus of a man who is confirming what he already expects to see. He spoke briefly to Farrow, asked 2 questions about the vitals trend, and decided on surgical exploration. His manner was calm and assured and organized around his own conclusions. Sela left Patricia's bay and walked to the doorway of Bay 3. not inside. She stood in the doorway and looked at the ultrasound image. She could see it from the angle, barely, but enough, and looked at Doyle's face. And looked at the way his pressure had ticked down another 3 points in the time it had taken Regan to arrive and review, and she said, "Quietly but clearly, doctor." "Regan." He didn't turn. "The hepatic artery," she said. "I think it's been displaced. The injury pattern doesn't fit standard blunt trauma. The pressure loss is too gradual and too consistent for a direct vessel tear, but the way his abdomen is presenting suggests the anatomy has been shifted. The impact created any torsion." "Thank you," Regan said. 2 words, delivered without turning his head, with the specific finality of someone who has been trained to respond without engaging. Conversational equivalent of a form letter. Sela stood in the doorway. The ultrasound image is showing the vessel positioned above the standard landmark. That's not a technical artifact. If you go in looking at the standard positionings, we have it from here. Regan picked up Doyle's chart. Didn't look at her. Farrow glanced at Sela briefly, the kind of glance that communicates sympathy without offering anything useful. A floor nurse named Britt, who had worked this hospital longer than anyone and had perfected the particular art of making herself invisible when things got tense, made eye contact with Sela for exactly 1 second and then looked at the floor. Sela watched them prep Doyle for transport. She watched the gurney move toward the elevator. She went back to Bay 1 and checked on Patricia, who asked about her son, and then she stood at the nursing station and kept her eyes on the clock and felt the particular low-grade alertness of someone waiting for something they already know is coming. Met's OR intercom request came 42 minutes later. Additional blood products, priority basis. Then a second request inside of 8 minutes. And the second request had a different quality to it. The words were the same kind of clinical language, but the delivery was compressed, stripped of the normal buffer of professional calm, and that specific quality told her everything she needed to know about what was happening in that room. She was moving before she had finished the thought. She took the stairs. Through the stairwell door, down the second-floor corridor, to the scrub sink outside OR 2, and she scrubbed with the efficiency of someone who has done this in far less sanitary conditions. 30 seconds, complete and methodical, no wasted motion. She gowned without asking anyone for help. She pushed through the OR door. The room was in that specific register of emergency that experienced teams operate and controlled enough to still be functioning, pressured enough that every person in it was working slightly faster than comfortable. The anesthesiologist was pushing fluid and watching numbers that weren't climbing fast enough. 2 residents were on suction, alternating, neither of them fast enough to keep the field clear. Regan was working with the focused intensity of a surgeon who has identified a problem and is trying to solve it through precision and force of will, which are real qualities. And sometimes they're enough, and right now they weren't. Sela looked at the field for 3 seconds and understood exactly what was happening and why. "Dr. Regan," she said. Her voice was not raised. She had learned in rooms much louder than this one that volume is not the same as authority. The hepatic artery is sitting 4 centimeters superior to where you're working. The displacement is real, and it's significant. You need to redirect your approach to the superior quadrant, or you're not going to control this. Nobody turned. "I can see it from here," she said. "The anatomy has been torqued by the impact. You're chasing a position that isn't there anymore." One of the residents, young, 2nd year, from the look of him, with eyes above the mask that were doing the math of a person, trying to figure out whether she was right before he had the standing to say so, out loud, glanced at her for a half-second and looked back at the field. The hemorrhage deepened. The suction fell further behind. Regan made an adjustment and then made another one, and the numbers on the anesthesiologist's board did not improve. Sela stepped forward. She moved to the lateral edge of the field, not into the primary surgeon's position, not into the sterile zone in a way that compromised it, and she reached in with the suction tip from the secondary port and cleared the pooled blood from a concentrated area with 3 deliberate strokes. And for 2 seconds, the anatomy beneath was visible in a way it had not been since the procedure began. The displaced artery was exactly where she had said it was, 4 centimeters superior to the standard landmark, sitting there like an answer that had been offered twice and not heard. Went still for 1 breath. Then he moved. He redirected. He repositioned his approach, and he clamped, and the bleeding stopped with the sudden quiet finality of a sound that has been playing so long you stopped hearing it, and now the room could hear itself again. "Pressure's coming up," the anesthesiologist said. His voice was careful and professional, the same words he'd use in a normal procedure, but there was something underneath them that everyone in the room understood. Sela stepped back. She held the suction tip clear and clean, stood exactly where she was, and she did not look at Regan, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said by her in this moment. Patients' numbers were moving in the right direction. That was the entire point. The room settled into the quieter work of closing. The residents moved more deliberately. The circulating nurse made notes. The monitors chirped at steady intervals. Then Regan turned. His eyes above the mask were not grateful, not even in the complicated way of someone who is grateful and hates that they are. They were something colder and more calculated than that. The expression of a man who has just been shown something in front of his team that he did not want them to see, and who is already framing how to characterize what just happened in a way that doesn't cost him anything. "Who authorized your entry into this OR?" he said. His voice was perfectly even. That was the part that told her the most. "Nobody authorized it," Sela said. "I came in because the patient's outcome depended on a different approach, and I had the information to provide it." "You are a floor nurse," Regan said, and he said it the way people say things they've decided in advance, not as an observation, as a verdict. "You have no surgical standing in this room. You entered without authorization, and you touched an active sterile field. I used the secondary suction port," she said, "in a way that didn't compromise sterility. Field is intact. The patient is stable. That is not your assessment to make." She looked at him. "I understand that's your position." "Leave this OR," he said. She left. She walked back down the stairs, and she went back to Bay 1, and she sat at the nursing station, and she documented the events of the previous hour, the time she had attempted to communicate her observation at the Bay 3 doorway, the time she had entered OR 2, the time of successful vessel clamp, the patient's current monitored status, and she wrote it out in precise clinical language with no editorializing, because editorializing was not the point, and precision was. She was finishing the last line of that documentation when Phil Garrett, the overnight charge nurse, appeared at her elbow with the particular expression of a man who has been given a message he did not volunteer to carry. "Sela," he said, then nothing else for a moment. "Phil." Dr. Regan filed an incident report. He put the paperwork on the counter. "CNO is involved. Administration is involved. He stopped. Started again. "They're asking you to surrender your badge and leave before the shift ends. Suspension pending review." She picked up the paperwork and read it. All of it. The language was institutional and carefully assembled unauthorized access to restricted clinical area, interference with active surgical procedure, violation of nursing scope of practice, potential breach of sterile protocol. Each charge was technically articulable. Each charge was also a version of what had happened that left out the part where Marcus Doyle was alive. She found the comments field. She wrote, "Patient arrived Bay 321, 47. Pressure trending 9460 decreasing. Attempted to communicate displaced vessel anatomy to attending surgeon at 21, 58, doorway of Bay 3. Entered or 2 at 22, 31, following priority blood product requests. Secondary suction performed lateral field edge. No sterile breach. Vessel clamp achieved 2233. Patient pressure stabilizing 2235 per anesthesiologist confirmation. She signed the acknowledgement, not the agreement. There was a difference, and she made sure it was visible. She handed the paperwork back to Phil, who took it with both hands and couldn't quite meet her eyes. She went to her locker. She took her time, with it not dawdling but not rushing either, because she was not going to let the urgency of someone else's discomfort dictate her pace. She changed out of her scrubs, put her personal items in her bag, and sat on the locker room bench for 60 seconds, doing nothing except breathing, which was something she had learned to do in worse moments than this one. Security officer at the main desk was a young man named Terrence, who she had spoken to maybe 8 times across 14 months. She handed him her badge, and he took it, and she thanked him, which seemed to confuse him slightly, and she walked out through the automatic doors. The air outside was cold and flat late October in Ohio, which does not dress up its weather in any particular way. Just cold, just still, just the parking lot lights buzzing, and the smell of exhaust from the idling ambulance bay, and the sky doing nothing dramatic overhead. She walked to her car, 7-year-old Honda, dent in the rear quarter panel. She unlocked it, put her bag on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. She was not panicking. Panic was not a state she had a lot of practice with, because she had spent 6 years in situations where panic was the one thing she couldn't afford, and that training doesn't fully retire just because the uniform does. What she was doing was thinking, going through it the way she went through anything that required response rather than reaction. The incident, the report, what Regan had filed, what the hospital's review process would look like, what she had documented, what she could prove, and what she was going to need that she didn't currently have. She was deep enough into that sequence that she didn't see the headlights until they were already in the lot. Not a car. A vehicle, a dark SUV moving with the deliberate quality of something that knows its destination. It pulled to a stop 20 feet from her Honda. The engine went quiet. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was somewhere in his early 50s. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, but he wore them the way people wear clothes, when clothes are not the primary language they operate in. His posture was straight in the particular way that outlasts uniforms. His movement across the parking lot was efficient, without being hurried. He covered the 20 feet between his vehicle and her car in a way that made the distance seem shorter than it was. She knew him before he got within 10 feet, not from anything recent. From further back, from a version of herself she had put into storage carefully, the way you store something that still has value, but that you're not ready to use, or not sure you're allowed to use, or not sure the world it belonged to still exists in a form you recognize. Stopped at her window. She lowered it. "Corporal Vance," he said. The rank landed strangely not wrong, just distant. She hadn't been addressed that way in years. She had been Nurse Vance for 14 months, and before that, she had been Sergeant Vance, and before that, early enough that she'd almost forgotten it, she'd been Corporal, which was where this man had first known her. And Colonel David Hartwell, she had served under him during her second deployment. He had the kind of command presence that didn't require volume, and he had never once, in all the time she'd known him, said something he didn't mean. He was looking at the hospital behind her. He let his gaze sit there for a moment, taking in the building, the lights, the automatic doors. Then he looked back at her, and his expression was not the expression of a man who was surprised to find her in this parking lot. It was the expression of a man who had known she would be here and had come because there was something that needed to be said, and it wasn't going to wait. "You need to tell me how you knew I was here," she said. "I will," he said. "Not in the parking lot." He nodded toward the SUV. "There's someone with me. There's something you need to hear, and after you hear it, tonight is going to look very different than it does right now." She looked at him for a long moment. She had learned to read people the way she read vitals, not just the number, but the trend. Hartwell was not performing anything, was not managing her. He was telling her a straightforward truth in the straightforward way he had always operated, which meant the thing he had come to say was real. She reached back, picked up her bag from the passenger seat, and got out of the car. The parking lot was cold and empty around them, the hospital lights throwing long shadows across the asphalt, and somewhere inside that building, Marcus Doyle was being closed and stabilized and moved toward recovery, and the paperwork with Sela's badge number on it was sitting on a charge nurse's counter, and 14 months of her DERS counter, debts of her life in that building had just ended in the space of a single night. Fell into step beside Hartwell and walked toward the SUV, and the door opened from inside before they reached it, and the figure in the back seat was someone she had never seen before, a woman, composed and watchful, holding a badge holder open so Sela could read the identification in the parking lot light. Department of Defense, Investigative Division. Sela read the name. She read the department. She looked up at the woman's face. "There's something you don't know about the patient you saved tonight," the woman said. "And there's something you definitely don't know about why your suspension notice was generated the same hour as his procedure." The SUV door closed behind her. The woman's name was Investigator Diane Presley, and she did not waste time on pleasantries, which Sela appreciated more than she would have appreciated pleasantries. The SUV was warm and smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long in a thermos. Hartwell took the front passenger seat and left Sela the back with Presley, who had a slim tablet on her knee and a folder on the seat beside her, and the organized stillness of someone who had conducted enough difficult conversations in confined spaces to have stopped finding them uncomfortable. The driver was a young man in civilian clothes who did not introduce himself and did not turn around, which told Sela he was military or adjacent to it. "Marcus Doyle," Presley said without preamble. "What do you know about him?" 53, Sela said. "Construction foreman. Pressurized fitting injury, upper abdomen. Presented at 9:47 with dropping pressure. Hepatic artery displacement, which I flagged twice before I entered the OR. Clinical picture," Presley said. "What do you know about what he does?" "Nothing. He was my patient for about 40 minutes, and he wasn't conscious for most of it." Presley nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she'd already expected. Turned the tablet around. There was a photograph of Doyle, not a hospital photo, a work photo, the kind taken on a job site. He was wearing a hard hat and standing in front of a structure that Sela didn't immediately recognize, but that had the specific silhouette of a government facility under construction. Doyle's company holds a logistic infrastructure contract with the Department of Defense, Presley said. 3 sites, 2 states. When a contractor in that classification has a critical medical event, we receive a notification. Standard protocol. We got the notification at 10:15. She paused. We also got something we weren't expecting. Hartwell turned in the front seat. He looked at Sela directly, which was something he did when he wanted her to pay a particular quality of attention. "Suspension notice for your badge, generated at 10:41, he said. Regan filed the incident report within minutes as the OR clearing. We were already looking at the hospital system because of the Doyle notification, and the timing of your suspension, the speed of it, flagged a secondary review." Sela processed that. "You're telling me the suspension got picked up because you were already in the system. I'm telling you the timing was unusual enough that it warranted a closer look," Presley said. "A nurse enters an OR during a critical event, the patient survives, and a formal incident report is generated and acted upon before the patient is even out of the OR. That's a fast institutional response. Regan runs a tight ship," Sela said. Her voice was neutral. "Maybe," Presley said. "Or someone made a call that didn't follow the normal review timeline." She closed the tablet cover and looked at Sela steadily. "I need you to give me a statement. I need you to give me a statement Everything from the moment Doyle arrived to the moment you walked out of the building. Times, observations, exact words if you have them. I already documented it, Sela said. In the hospital system, Presley said. The hospital controls. I need it from you directly in a format that exists outside that system. Sela looked at Hartwell. He gave her nothing, not a nod, not a shake. Just waited, which was his way of telling her the decision was hers. She gave the statement. She took her time with it, and she did not editorialize, and she did not perform emotion, because the facts of what had happened were sufficiently clear on their own, and dressing them up would only give someone a reason to pick at the dress instead of the facts. She spoke for 19 minutes. Presley recorded it on a small device and took notes on a legal pad with a mechanical pencil, and when Sela finished, Presley asked 4 clarifying questions about the ultrasound image, about the specific suction technique, about whether any other staff had acknowledged her presence at the OR door, about the wording of the conversation with Phil Garrett, and Sela answered all 4 without hesitation. Then Presley said, "We found something else." Before we came here tonight, quality of her voice had shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough that Sela's attention sharpened. There are 2 previous incidents in the hospital's internal reporting system, Presley said, involving nursing staff who raised concerns during procedures under Regan's supervision. Both within the last 3 years. Both resulted in disciplinary action against the nurse. Sela was quiet. The first one involved a medication concern flagged by a nurse during a pre-surgical prep. She raised it twice. The medication was administered at Regan's direction. A pharmacy audit conducted 6 weeks later confirmed the concern was clinically valid. The nurse had already been formally counseled for failure to follow surgical team direction by the time the audit came back. What happened to her? Sela asked. She's still at the hospital, Presley said. Different unit. She requested the transfer herself. Presley turned a page on her legal pad. Second incident, 18 months ago, a scrub nurse flagged a surgical safety concern mid-procedure. She was removed from the OR and placed on a performance improvement plan. She resigned 4 months later. The hospital's documentation characterized the event as a team communication issue. Sela, let that sit for a moment. Team communication issue. The language of an institution that has already decided what the record will say before it has finished deciding what happened. 2 incidents don't prove a pattern, she said. Not because she believed they didn't. She was already building the shape of it in her head, but because she wanted to hear what else Presley had. No, Presley agreed. They suggest one. She put down the legal pad. We're going to pull the full incident report, history, going back 5 years. That takes a formal request and it takes time. But I want you to understand why we're doing this, so you understand what tonight actually is. What is it? Sela asked. Presley looked at her. It's a data point that opened a door, she said. Question is what's behind it. The SUV was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hospital parking lot sat unchanged, the buzzing lights, the empty says, the automatic doors cycling open and closed for nobody. Somewhere behind those walls, Marcus Doyle was in post-op, his blood pressure stable, his hepatic artery clamped and repaired, his body doing the slow, unglamorous work of surviving something it nearly didn't. Hartwell spoke without turning around. You're not going back tomorrow. I know, Sela said. That's not a bad thing. She didn't answer that because she wasn't sure it was true yet, and she was not going to agree with something she wasn't sure about just because it came from someone she trusted. Presley handed her a card. I'll be in contact within 48 hours. Don't access the hospital's internal communication system for anything. Don't reach out to colleagues to discuss what happened tonight. If anyone from the hospital contacts you, administration, HR, Regan's attorney. I know how this works, Sela said. Presley looked at her briefly. Right, she said. And there was something in her voice that wasn't quite an apology, but was adjacent to the recognition that she had been explaining a process to someone who had spent 6 years operating in environments where processes were the difference between controlled outcomes and disasters. Sorry, it's fine. Sela picked up her bag. Is there anything else tonight? Hartwell turned fully now. He looked at her the way he had looked at her during one particular night in her second deployment, when she had been 24 and 4 hours into a 12-hour situation and running low on everything except the ability to stay in motion. He had looked at her then, and she had understood from that look that she was not alone in the room, which had mattered more than she'd been willing to admit at the time. Get some sleep, he said. We'll talk more tomorrow. She got out of the SUV and walked back to her Honda and drove home to the apartment she had rented 14 months ago, because it was 12 minutes from the hospital and the rent was something she could manage on a night shift differential. It was a one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that was fine without being anything. She had furnished it with the deliberate minimalism of someone who hasn't decided yet whether a place is permanent, and 14 months in, it still had that quality, functional, organized, not quite settled. Put her bag down and stood in her kitchen and drank a glass of water and thought about the 2 nurses Presley had described. The one who was still there, in a different unit, doing a different job than the one she'd been trained for because she had been right about something and been punished for being right and had found the path of least resistance and taken it. The one who had left entirely. Sela understood both of those decisions. She was not going to pretend she was above them. She was also not going to make either one. She went to bed at 3:40 a.m. and slept for 6 hours in the flat, immediate way she had learned to sleep during deployment, not because she was untroubled, but because the body needs what it needs and the mind can do its work better on the other side of rest. She woke at 9:50 a.m. to 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize and a text from Hartwell that said only, "Presley found something. We need to meet this afternoon." She texted back a time and an address, a diner 2 miles from her apartment, and public enough to be appropriate, quiet enough on a Tuesday morning to be useful, and then she sat on the edge of her bed and let herself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, and was probably the honest human version of both of those things, and then she got up. The diner was called Marcy's, and it smelled like hash browns and old coffee and the particular comfort of a place that has not changed its menu in 20 years. She arrived 8 minutes early and took a booth in the back where she could see the door, which was habit, and ordered black coffee, which was necessity. Hartwell and Presley arrived together at 12:14. Presley was carrying a different folder than the one from last night, thicker, tabbed, the kind of organized that takes time. She slid into the booth across from Sela. Hartwell sat beside Presley and looked like a man who had not slept. We pulled the incident history, Presley said, before the server had even offered them menus. And the 2 cases I told you about last night weren't the complete picture. Presley opened the folder. The 3rd, 8 months ago. An anonymous complaint submitted through the hospital's internal reporting portal separate from the standard incident system. Anonymous, so the staff member isn't identified. The complaint describes a surgical procedure in which a nurse verbally flagged the presence of a retained instrument before closure. The surgeon closed anyway. She looked up. The patient required a second operation 3 days later to remove it. Sela put her coffee cup down. The hospital settled the malpractice claim, Presley continued. $87,000. The settlement agreement included a confidentiality provision. The retained instrument incident was listed in the settlement documentation as a surgical team complication with no individual attribution. Meaning Regan's name doesn't appear in the settlement record, Sela said. Meaning Regan's name doesn't appear in the settlement record. Presley confirmed. The hospital absorbed the claim. The nurse who filed the anonymous report, we don't know for certain who it was, But the timing overlaps with an unexplained schedule change for one of the overnight scrub nurses on Regan's rotation. She went from 12 shifts a month to 4 within the 6 weeks following the complaint. The server appeared cheerful and unhurried to take their orders. Hartwell ordered coffee. Presley ordered nothing. The server left, still cheerful. "Who's the hospital administrator overseeing surgical credentialing?" Sela asked. Presley turned to a tabbed section. "Guy named Warren Albright. He's been in the administrative director role for surgical services for 6 years. He reports to the hospital CEO, but in practice, he handles credentialing, privilege renewals, and internal quality reviews for the surgical department independently." She paused. Regan's privilege renewal was processed 8 months ago. Routine on schedule, no flag. 8 months ago, Sela said. 4 weeks after the retained instrument complaint was submitted. The diner hummed around them, a couple at the counter, a family in the front booth, the sound of something sizzling in the kitchen. Ordinary Tuesday morning in a city that was not paying attention to any of this. Sela looked at Presley. "You're building toward something." "I'm building toward a formal investigation request," Presley said. "But I need more than incident reports and timing correlations. I need testimony. Specifically, I need yours, and I need it on record in a format that has legal weight outside the hospital's internal process." She closed the folder. "The hospital is going to convene a conduct review board. They're required to, under the terms of your suspension, it's in their bylaws, and you can demand it formally within 72 hours. If you do that, the board has to meet within 14 days. That gives us a defined timeline and a defined forum. And if I don't demand it," Sela asked, "then the suspension sits. It gets characterized as voluntary non-response, and in 6 months, it's just a closed file." Presley looked at her without any particular gentleness, which Sela found more respectful than the alternative. "You understand that demanding the board means putting yourself in a room with Regan and his representation. It means your service record, your clinical history, everything you did or didn't do in that, or all of it gets examined." "I know," Sela said. "I'm asking if you're prepared for that." Sela picked up her coffee. "I'm prepared for anything that gets the truth of what happened on the record," she said. "What I'm not prepared to do is let a man's 9-year habit of not listening to nurses get buried because the institution around him found it more convenient to settle quietly and reshuffle schedules." Presley looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, not warmly, not with any performance of being moved, but with the specific acknowledgement of someone who has heard what they needed to hear. Hartwell, who had been quiet through all of this, said, "There's something else." Sela looked at him. He put his hands around his coffee cup. He had the expression of a man who is about to say something he has been thinking about how to say for longer than this morning. "When you were discharged," he said, "you had an outstanding recommendation on file. Combat Medical Commendation, Service Excellence Notation, recommendation for promotion to Staff Sergeant." He paused. None of it was ever processed. Sela was still. "I filed that recommendation," Hartwell said. "I filed it the week before you discharged. I confirmed it was received. And then I followed up twice over the next 6 months and was told each time that it was under standard processing review." He looked at the table, then back at her. "I checked the file last week after I first heard your name in connection with the DOD notification from Lenox Valley. The recommendation isn't in your record. Not delayed. Not pending. Not there." The diner noise continued around them, easy, indifferent, the clatter and hum of a Tuesday that didn't know what it was sitting beside. "What happened to it?" Sela asked. Her voice was level, but level was a thing she was actively maintaining. "I don't know yet," Hartwell said. "That's a separate inquiry, and it's going to take time. But I want you to know that it existed because you deserve to know that. And because it tells me something about the pattern of what happens to people who do the right thing in the wrong rooms." Sela absorbed that. She had spent 3 years after her discharge not thinking about that recommendation, not because she didn't care about it, but because she had made a deliberate decision to put her military life in one category and her civilian life in another, and not let the distance between what she had been and what she was being allowed to be become something she visited too often. It had not been a healthy decision, exactly, but it had been a functional one. Now she sat in a diner booth on a Tuesday morning holding coffee that had gone slightly cold, and she felt the specific weight of several years of compressed things settling into a different arrangement. Not grief, exactly. Something harder-edged than that. File the formal board request, she told Presley. I'll give you the complete testimony, whatever you need documented, however you need it formatted. I'll do it. Presley nodded and reached into the folder for a standardized form that she clearly had brought, already prepared, which told Sela she had expected this answer, which told Sela she had read her correctly, which was fine. Sela had no objection to being read correctly by competent people. She signed the request form and dated it and handed it back, and they sat for another 40 minutes, going through the specific timeline Presley would need for the formal record, not Sela's version of events, but the clinical version, the documented version, the version that would hold up when Regan's attorney tried to reframe it. They would. Sela had no illusions about that. It was mid-afternoon by the time she got back to her apartment. She had 3 things to do, and she did them in order. She updated her own private documentation of events with the new information from Presley. She called her brother in Michigan, who she spoke to approximately 4 times a year, and who immediately sensed from her tone that something had happened, and who she told the factual version of because he deserved that. And then she sat at her kitchen table and wrote out by hand on a legal pad everything she remembered about the displaced artery, from the moment she first noticed the anomaly in the ultrasound image to the moment the clamp went on. Not for anyone else, for herself. Because she had learned that writing things down immediately, while the detail is still sharp, is the difference between a reliable account and a reconstructed one, and she was not going to need a reconstructed account when the real one was available. She was on the second page when her phone rang. Unknown number, she answered. Ms. Vance. The voice was male, professional, calibrated. Not a reporter too controlled for that. My name is Brett Salter. I'm legal counsel for Dr. Callum Regan. I'm reaching out as a professional courtesy. You should speak to my representation, Sela said. You haven't retained counsel yet, Salter said. We checked. That was true as of this morning, she said. It may not be true by the time you finish this sentence. A brief pause. Ms. Vance, my client has no interest in prolonging this situation. He's willing to consider a mutual resolution that allows both parties to move forward without mindset. Stop, she said. Say it. Whatever you're about to offer, whatever language you've constructed for a conversation that shouldn't be happening over the phone without representation present, you need to stop. I'm simply trying to... I know what you're trying to do, she said. And the answer is no. Whatever form the offer takes, the answer is no. If you want to communicate with me, communicate with my attorney. She ended the call. She sat for a moment looking at the legal pad. Then she picked up her pen and continued writing. The call from Regan's attorney meant something specific. They were moving fast, which meant they were worried, which meant the incident report Regan had filed was not as clean as he wanted it to look. An attorney reaching out to an unrepresented nurse within 16 hours of a suspension notice was not a professional courtesy. It was a calculation, the attempt to resolve something quietly before it became something public. Before formal proceedings gave it a timeline and a record that existed outside the hospital's control. He had moved fast to suspend her. Now he was moving fast to settle her. Speed, both times, told her everything about how certain he actually was. Finished her documentation. She put the cap on her pen. She thought about the nurse who had flagged the retained instrument, whoever she was, the person who had submitted the anonymous complaint, and then watched her schedule get cut by 2/3 and had said nothing more, at least not on record. She thought about the nurse who had been counseled for raising a medication concern that was later proven correct. She thought about the second operation a patient had needed because a surgeon had closed when he shouldn't have. 3 years of this, possibly more, possibly longer than anyone had yet found evidence for. She picked up her phone and called the attorney referral number Presley had given her at the diner. She left a clear, precise voicemail, her name, the situation in summary, the timeline, the fact that opposing counsel had already made contact. She gave her callback number and ended the message. Then she called Presley directly. "Regan's attorney called me," she said, when Presley picked up. A short silence. "How did he get your number?" "I'd like to know the answer to that too," Sela said. "He said he checked and I hadn't retained counsel." "That's either a guess or it isn't." Another silence, longer this time. "I'll look into it," Presley said. "Don't speak to him again." "I didn't speak to him this time," Sela said. "I told him to contact my attorney." "Good." Presley's voice shifted slightly. "There's something I was going to call you about anyway. Our records request came back faster than I expected." She paused. "Regan wasn't always at Lenox Valley." "I know," Sela said. "Most surgeons move around. He was at a hospital in western Pennsylvania before this. Aldermore General, he left 6 years ago. He left 6 years ago." Another pause, and this one was different from the others, not the pause of someone organizing information, but the pause of someone deciding how to say something that doesn't have a good way to be said. "There was a patient death at Aldermore 6 years ago. Surgical complication during an abdominal procedure. The official finding was team communication failure." Presley's voice was careful and precise. A nurse had flagged a critical anatomical landmark before the procedure reached the point of no return. The record shows the concern was noted and not acted upon. Patient died on the table. Sela stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and the legal pad on the counter and the afternoon light coming in at the angle it does in October, when it's already thinking about leaving for winter. Case was closed as a team failure. Presley continued. "Regan's name is in the record as attending surgeon. There are no individual findings, no personal disciplinary notation. He left Aldermore 4 months later." A pause. "Lenox Valley's credentialing file should have reflected that peer review history when they hired him." "Should have," Sela said. "There's a notation in the credentialing file," Presley said, "from Warren Albright. 6 years ago, when Regan was being onboarded. It says, peer review outcome from previous institution, pending confirmation. Flag for follow-up." Her voice went flat. "There's no follow-up notation. No confirmation documented. No resolution of the flag." Sela was quiet. "The flag just sits there," Presley said, unresolved. For 6 years. The kitchen was very still around her. She could hear the building, the low hum of the HVAC, someone's television, 2 floors down, a car in the parking lot below starting its engine and pulling away. Ordinary sounds of a building full of people, living ordinary afternoons. "Albright processed Regan's privilege renewal 8 months ago," Sela said, "after the retained instrument complaint." "He did," Presley said. "The unresolved flag from 6 years ago, was it still there when he processed the renewal?" "Yes," Presley said. "It was still there." Sela put her hand flat on the counter. Not for balance, not from shock. Just the physical need to be in contact with something solid, while the full shape of what she was looking at assembled itself in her mind. This was not one surgeon's arrogance. This was not a bad night in an operating room, or a personality conflict between a chief of surgery and a floor nurse who had stepped out of her designated lane. This was a man with a documented history of not listening, who had joined an institution that had received a warning about that history, and the person responsible for acting on that warning had looked at it and done nothing, then looked at it and done nothing again, 6 years later, when he was supposed to review the man's privileges, and done nothing again. And in the space of that nothing, patients had been harmed, nurses had been silenced, and a man's career had continued undisturbed. institutions find it easier to absorb disaster the cost of quiet disasters than to pay the visible price of confronting the people who cause them. I need you to add Albright to the formal record request, Sela said. Already done, Presley said. As of an hour ago. She paused. Sela, the board hearing is going to be about your suspension. But what we're building is bigger than your suspension. I know, Sela said. Are you ready for that? Sela thought about Marcus Doyle, alive in post-op because an artery had been found in time. She thought about the patient at Aldermore, whose nurse had spoken and not been heard, and who had not survived to need a second operation. She thought about the nurse who had left. She thought about the nurse who had stayed in the wrong unit, and the one whose schedule had been gutted for filing an anonymous complaint that had still not protected the patient it was filed about. Ask me something harder, she said. Presley was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that was not quite warmth, but was the professional equivalent of it, she said, I'll be in contact tomorrow morning. There's one more thing we're still pulling. It's from Aldermore's archived credentialing records. It may take until morning. What is it? Sela asked. The nurse, Presley said. The one who flagged the landmark at Aldermore. The one the record says raised the concern before the patient died. A pause. We don't have her name yet, but we're pulling the OR staff roster from that date. Another pause. And there's a notation in the margin of the case summary. Someone we don't know who wrote 3 words next to the nursing staff entry and then crossed them out. She stopped. What were the words? Sela asked. Presley read them slowly, as if she was looking at the document again as she spoke. 3 words, crossed out by someone who had known the truth and buried it anyway. Sela stood in her kitchen for a long time after the call ended. Not frozen, she was not someone who froze, but still in the particular way of a person who is letting something fully arrive before they decide what to do with it. The afternoon light had shifted. The building hummed around her. Counter, with her hand flat on the surface, and she thought about a nurse at Aldermore General 6 years ago, who had said the right thing, or General 6 years ago, who had said the right thing at the right moment, had not been heard, and whose patient had died, and whose name was still somewhere in an archived OR roster that Presley was pulling at this hour, and whose only memorial in the official record was 3 words in a margin that someone had then crossed out. She was right. Sela picked up her pen and went back to the legal pad. She was not done writing. The board hearing was scheduled for 9 days out, a Thursday morning in early November, in a conference room on the administrative floor of Lenox Valley Regional Medical Center. The formal notification arrived by certified mail 2 days after she filed the request, which was faster than Presley had expected, and which Presley said, when Sela called her, suggested that the hospital's legal team was already involved and had counseled administration to move the process forward rather than let it stall and accumulate. They want this done quietly and quickly, Presley said. That's fine, Sela said. So do I, for different reasons. She had retained an attorney by then, a woman named Gail Ostroff, who had spent 14 years doing medical employment law and who had the specific quality of someone who has seen every version of this particular story and has long since stopped being surprised by any of them. She was not warm. Exactly. She was direct and thorough, and she did not tell Sela what she wanted to hear, which was what Sela needed. Regan's representation is going to argue scope of practice, Ostroff told her, in their first real working session at Ostroff's office, which smelled like paper and the particular kind of quiet that comes from heavy soundproofing. They're going to make this about what a nurse is and isn't authorized to do in a surgical environment. And they're going to stay away from the clinical outcome as much as possible. Patients alive, Sela said. That's not their problem to solve, Ostroff said. Their problem is protecting their client's professional standing, and the most efficient way to do that is to make this a procedural question rather than a medical one. Did you have authorization to enter that OR? No. Did you interfere with an active sterile procedure? They'll argue yes. Everything else The displacement, the clamp, Doyle's blood pressure they'll frame as incidental. It wasn't incidental. I know, Ostroff said. And I know that you know that. But the board is made up of administrators, department heads, and a patient advocate. They're not all clinicians, which means we have to make the clinical picture clear enough that no one in that room can choose confusion. She looked at Sela across the desk. We need to establish two things beyond any reasonable dispute. First, what you saw was real and your assessment was clinically correct. Second, you communicated that assessment through appropriate channels before you acted, and those channels failed. Communicated it twice, Sela said, at the Bay 3 doorway directly to Regan, in front of Farrow and at least one OR nurse. Names. Farrow I know. The OR nurse, her name was Britt. I don't know her last name. She's been at the hospital for a long time. She works Regan's rotation regularly. Ostroff wrote it down. We'll subpoena the OR staff log for that night. Britt will be on it. She paused. Will she corroborate? Sela thought about the look Britt had given her in Bay 3 1 second of eye contact, then the floor. I don't know, she said honestly. She's been in that environment a long time. She knows how Regan operates, which means she has context and she has risk, Ostroff said. We'll approach her carefully. The 9 days between the notification and the hearing were not idle. Presley's investigation had expanded formally now, with a written authorization from the DoD's Inspector General's Division that gave her access to Lennox Valley's credentialing records and Regan's complete surgical file going back 6 years. Warren Albright had been notified of the records request and had responded through the hospital's legal counsel, which told Presley he understood what the request meant and had already decided to manage it rather than cooperate with it. Hartwell called Sela on the 5th day. He had news about the missing commendation. The recommendation he had filed during her discharge processing had been received by the administrative unit, logged, and then through a sequence of reassignments and a unit reorganization that had occurred 12 months after her discharge had been misrouted into an inactive file category that was not reviewed as part of standard record maintenance. It was not deliberate. It was the specific kind of institutional failure that comes from a system processing more paperwork than it has people to track, and the result was identical to deliberate action. Her record was missing something it should have contained, and that missing thing had consequences. We can correct it, Hartwell said. I know, she said. I want to do it before the hearing, he said. I want your complete service record entered into the formal proceedings. Not as a sympathy argument, as evidence of your clinical qualifications. My discharge papers already list my MOS, she said. Military Occupational Specialty Combat Medic, the full designation with the trauma qualification attached. Your discharge papers list the category, Hartwell said. Don't list the commendation, the specific field actions, or the advanced trauma certification you completed during your second deployment. Full record does. He paused. Regan's attorney is going to stand up in that room and call you a floor nurse. I want the board to have every piece of paper that explains exactly what kind of floor nurse you are. She didn't argue with that. The name came through from Presley on the 6th day. The Aldermore OR roster had been recovered from archived records, paper records, the kind that institutions keep in storage rooms and occasionally lose to water damage or disorganization, but which in this case had survived because the hospital had digitized its archives 2 years after the incident. The nurse who had flagged the anatomical landmark 6 years ago, whose concern had been recorded and not acted upon, whose patient had died, whose role in the case had been folded into the language of team communication failure, her name was Nora Weld. She had resigned from Aldermore 4 months after the incident. Presley had traced her through nursing license records. She was currently working at a long-term care facility in western Pennsylvania. She had not worked in a hospital surgical environment since leaving Aldermore. Presley had contacted her. She had not agreed to provide a statement yet. She's scared. Presley said, when she called Sela with the update. She's been carrying this for 6 years, and she built something that works for her. A job, a routine, an arrangement with what happened that lets her keep going. Asking her to open it back up is asking her to risk all of that. I'm not going to pressure her, Sela said. I know you're not, Presley said. I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you where we are. A pause. I'm going to give her time. But the hearing is in 4 days. I know, Sela said. She did not sleep particularly well over those 4 days. This was not unusual for her. She had not slept particularly well in several years, but it was a different quality of restlessness than the ordinary kind. She ran in the mornings 4 miles through the flat October streets, not because she was trying to manage anything, but because her body required motion, and the apartment was too small when she was thinking hard. She ate without paying much attention to it. She went over her testimony with Ostroff, twice more, each session tighter and more precise than the last, until the account of what had happened in Bay 3 and OR 2 was so cleanly organized in her head that she could have delivered it in any order, starting from any point without losing a detail. The night before the hearing, Presley called at 9:40 p.m. Nora Weld agreed to provide a written statement, she said. She won't appear in person. She said she can't do that. But she'll sign a sworn declaration and allow it to be entered into the record. Sela sat on the edge of her bed. What does it say? I haven't seen the final draft yet, Presley said. But she told me the basics. She flagged the landmark. Regan acknowledged her verbally. She's specific about that, he said. He heard her, and then he continued without adjusting his approach. Patient went into cardiac arrest at table. The arrest was managed, but the damage was irreversible. Patient died in post-op 6 hours later. Presley's voice was level, but the level was effortful. The incident review characterized it as a communication breakdown. Nora's statement in the review was summarized as nursing staff reported anatomical concern. Surgeon assessed and determined standard approach appropriate. She said that summary and didn't recognize what had happened. Sela was quiet. She said the reason she's agreeing to the declaration is that she doesn't want someone else to have to sit in a room and watch her version of events get summarized into something that sounds like no one's fault, Presley said. She said she'd been watching this for a long time, and she thought maybe she was the only one. And finding out she wasn't, she said it was something she hadn't expected to feel. After the call ended, Sela sat with the phone in her hand and thought about Nora Weld in western Pennsylvania at a long-term care facility where nobody was going to die because she spoke up and nobody listened, where the stakes were real but different, where she had found a version of nursing that didn't require her to be in the room where the worst things could happen. She understood it completely. She did not judge it at all. She put the phone down and went to bed and slept 4 hours, which was enough. The administrative conference room on the 4th floor of Lenox Valley Regional Medical Center was beige and fluorescent, and furnished with the specific indifference of a room that is used for many things and designed for none of them. There was a long table, 8 chairs on one side, 3 on the other. Projector screen at the far end. A water pitcher that had been filled, but around which no glasses had been placed, which struck Sela as a precise metaphor for the institution's general approach to human needs. She arrived with Ostroff at 8:52. Regan was already there, on the far side of the long table, in a suit that had been chosen with the specific care of a man who understands that clothing is also an argument. He looked composed. His attorney Salter sat beside him with a laptop open and a notepad at a precise angle. They did not look up when Sela and Ostroff entered. The board convened at 9:03. 5 members, the hospital CEO, a woman named Patricia Howell, who had the particular authority of someone who did not get to her position by being moved by things that were designed to move her, the chief nursing officer, a man named Gerald Sapp, who had the uncomfortable quality of someone who knows which way the wind is blowing from 2 directions. Simultaneously, Dr. Francis Merritt, a retired trauma surgeon who served as the board's independent clinical reviewer, a patient safety advocate named Doug Yoon, and Warren Albright, administrative director of surgical services, who sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that was trying to look neutral and not quite succeeding. Howell opened the proceedings without ceremony. She stated the purpose, the timeline, the scope of review. She stated that both parties had been given the opportunity to submit documentation in advance and that the board had reviewed all submitted materials. She stated that each party would have time to present, that the board would ask questions, and that the board's determination would be issued within 5 business days of the close of proceedings. Salter went first. He was good. Sela had expected him to be good, and he was in the specific way of someone who has prepared for the version of this hearing that he controls rather than the version that might get away from him. He built the case methodically. Sela Vance was a floor nurse, not a surgical nurse. She had no standing in OR 2. She had entered a restricted area without authorization during an active procedure and had physically intervened in the sterile field. He cited the hospital's access protocols, the nursing scope of practice guidelines, the definition of unauthorized interference as written in the hospital's internal policy manual. He cited her 14-month personnel file, unremarkable, no disciplinary history, no surgical rotation, as evidence that she had no institutional basis for the judgment she claimed to have exercised. He was careful never to say the word wrong. He said outside her lane and beyond her designated scope, and an action that, however well-intentioned, created risk rather than reducing it. He did not mention Marcus Doyle's post-operative status. He mentioned the patient once, briefly, in the framing of the patient, whose care was under Dr. Regan's charge, and then moved on. When he finished, Howell looked at Ostroff. Counsel. Ostroff stood. She did not match Salter's pace or his register. She was quieter than him and more precise, which, in a room like this one, was more effective. She opened with the clinical record. Not Celis's account of it, the hospital's own monitoring data from Bay 3 and OR 2, the objective numbers, the time-stamped record of Doyle's pressure in the 40 minutes between his arrival and Sela's entry into the OR. Put it on the projector. 94/60 at arrival, she said. 89/58 at 9:55. 86/54 at 10:08. This is the monitoring record. This is not interpretation. She clicked to the next slide. At 10:22, the OR requests additional blood products. Priority basis. At 10:29, a second request is made. At 10:31, Sela Vance enters OR 2. She put down the remote. The question before this board is whether she should have been there. I want the board to hold that question in mind alongside a different one. If she hadn't been, what is the trajectory of those numbers? Salter said, that's speculative. Merritt, the retired trauma surgeon, said, the clinical question. She looked at Salter without particular hostility and without any particular warmth. I'll be asking it regardless, Ostroff continued. She entered Sela's full military service record, the complete version, with the restored commendation and the advanced trauma certification, the field surgical qualification from the second deployment, specific documented cases in which she had managed abdominal trauma in forward surgical units. She did not narrate it emotionally. She read the relevant qualifications in the same tone she had used for the blood pressure numbers. Then she called Sela to speak. Sela stood, and she did not look at Regan when she began. She looked at Merritt because Merritt was the person in the room who would understand what she was about to say at the level it needed to be understood. And in her experience, you speak to the person who can hear you and you trust the record to carry the rest. She described the anatomy. She described the displacement, what caused it, what it looked like on the ultrasound image, why the standard approach would miss it, and what the consequences of missing it would be in the specific physiological context of Doyle's presentation. She described it the way she had described it to herself in the 6 years before this room existed, in forward units where there was no time to make the explanation comfortable for anyone. Precise, specific, without hedge. The hepatic artery, when displaced superiorly by impact torsion, does not present at the standard surgical landmark, she said. It presents 4 to 6 centimeters superior, depending on the degree of displacement. An approach targeting the standard landmark in that context will not locate the vessel. It will locate adjacent tissue. In the presence of active hemorrhage, that delay is not recoverable time. Merritt said, and you identified this from the ultrasound image in Bay 3. Yes, before the procedure began. Yes, and you communicated it. Twice. At 9:58 at the doorway of Bay 3, directly to Dr. Regan, in the presence of Dr. Farrow and at least one OR nurse. Dr. Regan responded with thank you and did not engage with the substance of the concern. Merritt wrote something on her notepad. Salter said, Miss Vance, you were standing in a doorway, looking at a portable ultrasound screen from a distance. Are you certain of your read of that image? Yes, Sela said. You're not a radiologist. No, she said. I'm someone who has read the same kind of image in conditions significantly worse than a hospital bay and acted on that read with patient outcomes that are documented in the record my attorney just submitted. Salter paused. He moved on. Then Ostroff submitted the secondary documentation. The 2 prior nursing incidents from Lenox Valley's own internal system. The anonymous complaint about the retained instrument. The malpractice settlement. She submitted them not as character evidence, but as pattern evidence. A documented history of nurses raising clinical concerns during Regan's procedure, a documented history of those nurses being disciplined, and a documented history of the concerns they had raised, proving to have been clinically valid after the fact. Regan's expression did not change, but something around his eyes did a compression, a tightening, the look of a man who has just watched the edge of the frame he built start to flex. Salter objected. These incidents have no bearing on the specific circumstances. They establish context, Ostroff said. The board is being asked to evaluate whether Ms. Vance's actions constituted a deviation from appropriate nursing conduct. Context is relevant to that evaluation. Howell said, the objection is noted. The materials are admitted. Then Ostroff submitted Nora Weld's sworn declaration. She read the relevant section aloud. The room was very quiet while she read it, not the performing quiet of people pretending to listen, but the actual quiet of a room in which something has arrived that everyone in it can feel the weight of. She read Nora's account of flagging the anatomical landmark. She read the account of Regan saying he heard her. She read the account of him continuing without adjustment. She read the outcome. When she finished, Albright shifted in his seat. Merritt said, the patient death at Aldermore General, this is documented. The declaration is sworn, Ostroff said. The Aldermore case record is part of a separate federal investigation currently underway. Formal request has been made for the complete case file. Regan said that case was reviewed and closed. It was the first time he had spoken directly since the proceedings began, and the room registered it not dramatically, but the way rooms register when someone breaks a pattern they've been maintaining. Howell looked at him. Dr. Regan, please direct your responses through counsel. Salter put a hand on the table, a small gesture, a redirect. Regan sat back, but the word was out. That case was reviewed and closed. Said in the tone of someone reciting a conclusion they have been depending on for a long time. Howell's expression did not change. Merritt's did just slightly, just around the corners of her eyes, the look of a person making a specific kind of note. Ostroff submitted one final document. The credentialing file notation from 6 years ago. Warren Albright's own handwritten note, peer review outcome from previous institution, pending confirmation, flag for follow-up. and the 6-year absence of any follow-up entry. Albright's hands, which had been folded on the table, unfolded. "Mr. Albright," Ostroff said, and her voice was perfectly even. "You processed Dr. Regan's privilege renewal 8 months ago." Albright looked at Howell. "I don't think this—" "The credentialing record is within the scope of this review," Howell said. Her voice carried the specific quality of someone who has understood in the last 20 minutes that the scope of this review is considerably larger than she was told it would be when she agreed to chair it. "Please respond." Albright said, "Privilege renewals are routine process." "The flag from 6 years ago," Ostroff said. "Was it resolved before the renewal was processed?" A pause. "The flag was reviewed. Was it resolved?" Another pause. Longer. "The documentation from Aldermore was not complete at the time of the original flag." "That was the status 6 years ago," Ostroff said. "Was the documentation complete at the time of renewal 8 months ago?" The room held the question. Albright held it with the room, and everyone watching could see him holding it, which was itself an answer. "I relied on available information," he said. Merritt set down her pen. She set it down in a particular way deliberately, without announcement, and looked at the middle of the table between herself and the document. Ostroff had just submitted, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been a trauma surgeon for 30 years and has developed a precise internal instrument for identifying the moment when a thing cannot be walked back. "Dr. Regan," she said. "Not Salter. Regan." Salter said, "Board members should direct." The credentialing record contains a notation that Dr. Regan arrived at this institution with an unresolved peer review flag from a prior facility, Merritt said, without raising her voice, without looking at Salter. A patient at that facility died during a procedure in which a nursing concern was documented and not acted upon. That flag was never resolved. That privilege renewal was processed anyway. She looked at Regan directly. "You were aware of the Aldermore case. It was not phrased as a question." Regan's attorney said, "My client does not need to respond to." "Statement," Merritt said. "He can confirm or correct it." Regan sat very still, and in that stillness, in the specific quality of it, not the stillness of someone who doesn't know what to say, stillness of someone who has spent a long time knowing exactly what he would never say the room, understood something it could not ununderstand. Howell said, "We'll take a 30-minute recess." She said it quietly and with the controlled composure of someone who is already thinking about what happens next. And the room stood and people separated into corners, and the water pitcher sat in the center of the table with no glasses. And Sela stood near the window and looked out at the parking lot 4 floors below and the flat Ohio sky above it. And Ostroff came to stand beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then Ostroff said quietly, "The board isn't coming back in 30 minutes to discuss your suspension." Sela knew. She had known since Merritt set down her pen. "They're coming back to discuss what happens to him," she said. Ostroff nodded, and to figure out what Albright knew and when he knew it, she paused. And to figure out what Howell knew or should have known about what Albright was or wasn't doing. Another pause. "This is not the hearing they planned to run today." "No," Sela said. Outside the parking lot was just a parking lot cars sitting in marked spaces, a facilities truck near the service entrance, a nurse in green scrubs crossing the lot with her head down against the cold. Ordinary late morning in a hospital that was still, from the outside, exactly what it had always looked like. Sela was watching the door to the conference room when it opened before the 30 minutes were up 8 minutes in, which was not a recess, which was something else, and a hospital administrator he hadn't seen before, entered and spoke quietly to Howell, who had not gone far. Howell listened. Her face did not move. Then Howell looked across the room, and for a moment her eyes met Sela's, and then she looked away and spoke again to the administrator, and whatever she said made the administrator turn and leave faster than he had entered. Ostroff was already moving toward Sela. Something came in. she said low. Something external. What? Sela asked. Ostrov shook her head. She didn't know yet. But she had her phone in her hand, and a message was on the screen, and she read it and looked up with an expression that Sela had not seen on her face in any of their previous conversations. Presley's office, Ostrov said. They pulled the full Aldermore case file. She looked at Sela steadily. There was a second nurse, not Nora Weld, a different nurse, different procedure, 8 months before the patient death. She filed a formal complaint about Regan's conduct during a surgical case. The complaint was received by Aldermore's administration. She paused. It was received, logged, and forwarded to credentialing for review. She stopped. And, Sela said. The forwarding note, Ostrov said. The routing record from Aldermore, it shows, the complaint was forwarded to the receiving institution when Regan transferred. She looked down at her phone again, then back up. Forwarded to Lenox Valley, 6 years ago. To the credentialing department. She turned the phone so Sela could read the screen. The routing record showed the recipient clearly, Warren Albright, by name. The routing record sat on Ostrov's phone screen for 4 seconds before Sela looked away from it. Not because she needed more time to understand what it meant. She understood it immediately, completely, in the way that a thing makes sense when is the piece that explains the shape of everything around it. Warren Albright had not failed to follow up on the Aldermore flag because of a disorganized credentialing system or a unit reorganization or the ordinary institutional friction of paperwork moving between facilities. He had received a formal complaint about Regan's conduct directly by name 6 years ago, and he had processed Regan's hiring anyway. And he had written a follow-up flag in the credentialing file that he had never intended to resolve, because the flag was not a reminder. Cover. A notation that said he had noted the issue in case anyone ever looked, in a file that he controlled and that nobody was likely to look at until something went wrong enough to make looking unavoidable. Something had gone wrong enough. She had gone wrong enough. She looked away from the phone because the full weight of what Albright had done was settling in a place that was not useful to her in this room. At this moment, and she had long practice at separating the weight of a thing from the work the thing required. Put the weight aside. She looked at Ostrov. Presley needs to be in contact with Howell directly, she said, before the board reconvenes, not through us, officially, from the DOD investigation. So it enters the record as external evidence rather than something we introduced. Ostrov was already typing on it, and Albright cannot leave this building before that happens, Sela said. Ostrov looked up briefly. He's a hospital administrator, not a flight risk. He's a man who just watched 6 years of careful management start coming apart in a conference room, Sela said. I'm not making assumptions about what people do when they realize the floor has shifted. Ostrov sent the message and made a call, stepping away toward the window. Sela stayed where she was and watched the conference room door and thought about Warren Albright at the end of the table with his hands unfolded, with his careful neutral expression losing its calibration, with the routing record now sitting in Presley's file and making its way toward this building. The recess ran 22 minutes before Howell came back to the doorway and gestured for everyone to return. Her face had changed, not in any dramatic way, not the kind of change a person performs for an audience, but in the way a face changes when it has received information that has fundamentally altered the terrain of what it was dealing with. She looked older than she had looked 22 minutes ago. She looked like someone who had spent those minutes understanding the shape of something she was now going to have to inhabit. They settled back into their seats. Regan and Salter returned from a separate corner of the hallway where they had been speaking in low voices that had the cadence of two people negotiating in a language made of bad options. Reason sat. His composure was still there, but it was structural, now maintained through effort. Visible as effort if you knew how to look. Albright came back last. He sat at the end of the table and folded his hands again, and his face was performing neutral, so hard it had become its own kind of tell. Howell said, Before we resume, the board received a formal communication from a federal investigative authority regarding materials relevant to these proceedings. She did not look at Albright when she said it. She was careful not to. The board is in receipt of a credentialing transfer document from Aldermore General Medical Center, dated 6 years ago, addressed to this institution's surgical credentialing department. The document contains a formal nursing complaint regarding Dr. Regan's conduct during a surgical procedure at Aldermore. She paused. The receiving record shows the document was delivered and logged. Salter said immediately, the board should suspend proceedings pending review of. The board determines its own process, Howell said. The words were quiet and absolute. We will continue. She looked at Albright, not with hostility, with something much worse than hostility, with the specific look of a woman who has just understood that the problem in this room is not the one she was told it was going to be, and that the person who failed to tell her that is currently sitting at her table. Mr. Albright, she said, the routing record shows this document was received by you personally, by name. Albright's jaw moved slightly. Credentialing receives a high volume of by name, Howell repeated. The room held that. Merritt had her pen in her hand but was not writing. Sapp, the chief nursing officer, was looking at the table with the expression of a man mentally drafting something he was going to have to write later. Yuan, the patient advocate, was looking at Albright with the uncomplicated directness of someone who does not have a professional relationship with any of the people in this room to protect. Salter intervened before Albright could continue. My representation is for Dr. Regan, and I want to be clear that these questions are directed at a separate individual and fall outside the scope of today's. Minus. Your representation is noted, Howell said. The scope of today's proceedings is determined by this board. She looked at the folder in front of her, the one she had arrived with that morning, the one that had contained a much simpler set of questions than the one she was now holding. Closed it. She did not open the replacement documents that Ostroff had submitted. She knew what was in them. We'll take questions from the board. Merritt went first. She directed her questions at Sela, but they were not adversarial, they were clinical. The questions of someone who has already made a determination and is building the formal record to support it. She asked about the specific anatomical presentation, the angle of displacement, the suction technique, the duration of time between the successful clamp and post-operative stabilization. Sela answered each one with the precision she had spent 9 days preparing, and Merritt wrote, and the room was very quiet. Then Merritt said, in your assessment, was there a clinical window, a point before you entered or two, at which the outcome could have been redirected without your intervention? Sela thought about that for exactly the time it deserved. I think there was a window when I communicated the displacement concern at Bay 3, she said. If that concern had been investigated before the procedure began another look at the ultrasound, a consultation, it's possible the approach could have been adjusted before the hemorrhage became uncontrollable. She paused. By the time I entered the OR, I don't think there was a remaining window that didn't require the information I had. And you provided that information, Merritt said. Provided it twice before I entered the room, and once more when I was in it, Sela said. The third time was the one that was acted on. Merritt looked at Regan when Sela said that. She didn't say anything. She just looked, briefly, and then looked back at her notepad. Regan's attorney had stopped objecting. That was the thing Sela noticed, the point at which Salter went from managing the proceedings to managing his client, because managing the proceedings was no longer something he could do, and managing his client was something he could at least attempt. He leaned toward Regan twice during Merritt's questioning. Regan did not lean back. He sat with his hands in front of him, and his face arranged into something that was trying to be composure and was becoming incrementally and visibly something else. Howell called a second recess at 11:40. 30 minutes. The language this time was more deliberate. She said the board needed to confer privately on procedural matters, which was not the language of a board that was about to return and discuss a nurse's suspension. It was the language of a board that was about to do something it had not planned to do when it arrived. Ostroff used the 30 minutes to make 2 calls. Sela used them to drink water and stand at the window, and watch the parking lot and let her mind go briefly quiet, which was not the same as going blank. It was the specific quality of stillness she had learned in situations where there was nothing productive left to do until the next thing required response, and the discipline of not filling that stillness with noise. Her phone buzzed. Presley, Albright's credentialing access log, pulled. He ran an active search on the Aldermore case 6 weeks before the privilege renewal 8 months ago. He knew what he was renewing. She showed it to Ostroff, who read it and exhaled through her nose. He didn't just inherit the flag, Ostroff said. He looked it up. He made a decision, Sela said. Yes, Ostroff said. He made a decision. She looked at the conference room door, which means this is not a negligence question. This is a conduct question. A pause. Which changes what kind of conversation the board is having in there right now. The board returned at 12:17. They had been in there 37 minutes. Howell sat down and her face had the quality of someone who has emerged from a room in which something irrevocable has been decided and who is now carrying the weight of making it legible. The board has determined, she said, that the scope of today's proceedings must be formally expanded to address matters beyond the original suspension review. Effective immediately, this hearing is designated a Level 2 institutional review under the hospital's bylaws, which grants the board authority to address clinical privilege matters and administrative conduct simultaneously. Salter said, the board cannot unilaterally expand. The board's bylaws explicitly authorize this designation, Howell said. Hospital Legal Counsel has confirmed. You have 60 seconds to review the relevant section, if you'd like. She slid a document down the table. Salter looked at it. He did not take the 60 seconds. He picked up his pen and wrote something on his notepad, and the thing he wrote had the quality of something being prepared rather than something being processed. Regan was watching Howell. He had been watching her since she sat down with the specific attention of a man whose internal calculations have shifted from managing a proceeding to assessing a threat. Howell said, Dr. Regan, in light of the expanded scope of this review, the board is formally requesting your response to the Aldermore case documentation. Specifically, were you aware at the time of your credentialing at Lenox Valley that a nursing complaint regarding your conduct had been formally filed at Aldermore and forwarded to this institution? The room was so quiet that Sela could hear the HVAC system cycling through its rotation. Salter said, my client will not be responding to that question in this forum. That is your client's right, Howell said evenly. The board notes the non-response. Merritt looked at Regan with an expression that was not anger and was not contempt. It was something more specific than either of those, the expression of someone who has spent a career in operating rooms and understands with precision what it means when a person who should have the answers declines to give them. Then Howell looked at Albright. Albright looked back at her. He had the look of a man who has spent 6 years believing that the architecture of what he built was solid enough to hold, and who is now watching the specific load-bearing element he counted on begin to fail. Mr. Albright, Howell said, the board has reviewed the access log for the credentialing system. 43 days before Dr. Regan's privilege renewal was processed, you ran an active search query on the Aldermore case file in our system. She paused. This means the information was not buried, not forgotten, not inaccessible. It was reviewed. Another pause, and then the renewal was processed without notation. Albright said aye, and then stopped. It was the stop that mattered. Not what came before it, not whatever came after it would have been. Stop, the half word, the place where the prepared explanation ran out before it reached the air. Howell waited. I made a judgment call, Albright said finally. His voice was the voice of someone who knows this is not enough and is saying it anyway, because there is nothing else available. The Aldermore case was closed. There were no findings against Dr. Regan individually. The privilege renewal criterion. You reviewed a complaint that documented a nurse raising a surgical concern, the concern not being acted upon, and a patient dying, Howell said. And you renewed his privileges 43 days later without flagging any of it. Case was closed as a team failure, Albright said. Regan had no individual. You didn't flag it, Howell said. Albright stopped again. Howell looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone in the room. Then she looked at the rest of the board and said, "We'll continue." The afternoon session went 3 hours. It did not feel like 3 hours. It had the compressed quality of time in a room where the pressure is high enough that the normal intervals collapse, where an hour passes in what feels like 20 minutes and a silence that 8 seconds feels longer than either. Ostroff entered the additional incident documentation in full, the medication complaint, the OR nurse who had been moved off Regan's rotation after filing the anonymous retained instrument report, the former scrub nurse who had left the hospital. She did not argue each one individually. She laid them in sequence and let the sequence speak, which it did. Merritt asked the question that nobody else had quite asked directly. She addressed it to the board rather than to any individual, which was a technique Sela recognized the rhetorical move of a person who wants an answer on the record, without making it easy for anyone to dodge by claiming the question was directed at someone else. The board is looking at a documented pattern, Merritt said, spanning at least 6 years at 2 institutions. Nursing staff raise clinical concerns. The concerns are valid. The concerns are not acted upon. In one case, a patient died. In each case, the nurse who raised the concern experienced professional consequences. And the administration responsible for reviewing this surgeon's credentials received documentation of the pattern and renewed his privileges without notation. She set her pen on the notepad. I want the board to be clear in its deliberations that what we are reviewing is not a nurse who acted outside her scope. We are reviewing a system that made it dangerous to act inside it. Nobody objected to that. Not Salter, not Albright. Not even Regan, who sat at the far end of the table with his hands in front of him and his composure reduced now to the thinnest possible film over something that was much less controlled beneath it. Salter made one more attempt. He was good enough to make it a real one, arguing that the pattern evidence was circumstantial, that no formal finding had ever been made against Regan individually, that the board was being asked to act on correlation and implication rather than adjudicated fact. He argued it cleanly and with the precision of someone who has prepared this argument thoroughly and knows it's his last viable line. Merritt waited until he finished. Then she said, "The nurse warned him." He continued. The patient was harmed. In each case, she picked up her pen again. At what point does correlation become a pattern that a credentialing body is obligated to act on? Salter did not answer that. There was no version of an answer that helped his client. Regan looked at his attorney. Something passed between them, not words, just the specific quality of a look that communicates a recalculation. Salter leaned toward him. Regan leaned back slightly, the body language of someone who has decided something in the last 30 seconds and is about to make it visible. Then Regan said, "I want to make a statement." Salter said, "Callum." "I want to make a statement," Regan said again. His voice was steady. It had the quality of a voice that has decided the form of what it's going to say, even if it hasn't fully decided the content yet, which is a specific kind of courage and a specific kind of calculation simultaneously. Howell said, "The board will hear it." Regan looked at the table in front of him. Not at Sela, not at the board. Not at Albright. At the table, which was neutral territory. The retained instrument case, he said. The nurse flagged it before I closed. I heard her. I assessed that the closure was appropriate, and I proceeded. He stopped. Thought about that case. I've thought about it a number of times. I didn't process it the way I should have. Another stop. I should have verified. The room held that. It was not a full confession. It was not even close to a complete accounting. It was the specific shape of an admission that has been carefully sized to be as small as possible while still being technically true, and everyone in the room understood that. And it was still, in the specific context of this hearing on this day, more than anyone had expected to hear him to say. Salter said nothing. He was writing. Merritt said, "And the Aldermore case?" Regan looked up. He looked at Merritt directly. "I was aware of the complaint," he said. "When I transferred, I was aware. The room absorbed that differently than it absorbed the retained instrument admission. That one had been managed. This one had a different quality, the quality of something that has been held a long time and is being put down not because the person holding it has decided to be honest, but because the weight has finally exceeded the capacity to carry it." Howell said, "The board will recess for deliberation. All parties will be notified of the determination within 5 business days." It was 4:18 in the afternoon. The room cleared in stages. Regan and Salter left together, close, speaking in voices too low to hear. Albright left quickly, alone, without speaking to anyone, and Sela watched him go and thought about what a man does when he has spent 6 years betting on a structure and has just watched it identified from the ground up. Ostroff gathered documents with the methodical calm of someone who has done what she came to do. Merritt paused at the door and looked at Sela just for a moment, just long enough to be a look rather than an accident, and then she left without saying anything, which was its own kind of communication. Saps, the chief nursing officer, stopped near the door. He had barely spoken during the proceedings. He was a man who had spent the day understanding something, and it showed professionally. He looked at Sela with the uncomfortable expression of someone who has worked in an institution for long enough to have become part of its habits without fully examining them, and who is now examining them. "2 nurses from the incident reports," he said. "The ones in our system." "Yes," Sela said. "I need to talk to them," he said. "Not for the record. Just I need to talk to them." Sela looked at him. He was not performing anything. He was a man with a specific quality of discomfort that comes from realizing you had authority you didn't use. "You know who they are," she said. "I do," he said. And then he left. Ostroff touched Sela's arm briefly. "Come on, let's get out of this building." They took the elevator down. The lobby of Lenox Valley Regional Medical Center was doing what lobbies do in mid-afternoon, visitors arriving, visitors leaving, the information desk fielding questions, the gift shop open, family sitting near the entrance with the strained, collective posture of people in the middle of a long wait. Ordinary motion of an institution that keeps running regardless of what is happening on its 4th floor. Sela pushed through the automatic doors, and the October air hit her the same way it had hit her 2 weeks ago, when she had walked out for the last time with her bag over her shoulder and her badge gone flat and cold and indifferent. But it felt different now. Not warmer, just different. The way air in the same place can feel different when the circumstances around it have changed. Ostroff said, "The 5-day window is procedural. Based on what happened in there today, I'd expect interim action faster than that." "Interim on Regan or Albright?" Sela said. "Both," Ostroff said. Regan's admission about the retained instrument case is going to trigger an independent review of his surgical record. Once that's initiated, his privileges are effectively suspended pending outcome. And Albright? She paused. Albright ran that search. He made an active decision. That's not an oversight. That's a conduct matter, and Howell knows it. "What does she do with it?" Sela asked. "Depends on what she's willing to own," Ostroff said. whether she knew anything about Albright's process before today, whether the board has been rubber stamping his decisions, whether this is an Albright problem or a structural problem. She looked at Sela. Based on the way she ran that room today, I think she's going to own it rather than manage it. I've seen administrators manage these things. She wasn't managing. Sela's phone buzzed. Presley, she answered. I was going to call you. I know, Presley said. I watched the feed. The hearing had been formally recorded, which Presley had access to through the investigative authorization. Regan's statement changes the retained instrument case from a closed file to a reopened inquiry. We're submitting that to the state medical board tonight. A pause. An Albright's access log plus the routing record that goes to the Ohio Attorney General's office as a potential credentialing fraud referral. Another pause. Shorter. This is bigger than a suspension hearing now. Yes, Sela said. Are you all right? Presley asked. It was the first time she had asked that, not because she hadn't cared before, but because there hadn't been a natural moment for it in the transactional sequence of building a case. And Presley was not the kind of person who created moments artificially. Sela stood in the parking lot of the hospital that had suspended her 12 days ago. It was days ago, and thought about whether she was all right. It was a real question, and she gave it real consideration. She was tired. Her left shoulder had the low ache it always had when she'd been tense for an extended period, which was a residual issue from her second deployment that no amount of physical therapy had fully resolved. She had not eaten anything since 7:30 this morning. She had just spent 7 hours in a room being examined and examining, and she had done it without losing her thread or her composure, which was something she could be honest with herself about being proud of, even if she wouldn't say it out loud to anyone. I'm functional, she said. Presley made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Good enough. A pause. There's one more thing. The state medical board, when they receive the referral tonight, they have authority to issue an interim suspension of Regan's license pending investigation. That's separate from the hospital's privilege action. It means he doesn't operate anywhere in Ohio while this is under review. When does that happen? Sela said. Filing goes in tonight. Emergency interim suspension review is typically 48 to 72 hours. A pause. Sela. You know his surgical record at this hospital is going to be pulled. Every case, every outcome, every nursing note from every procedure. I know, she said. They're going to find other incidents, Presley said. I can almost guarantee it. Not necessarily cases like Doyle's, not necessarily things that reached the threshold of a formal complaint, but patterns in the nursing notes, ways that concerns were documented and then not followed up on. Kind of thing that reads as normal variation until you're looking for a pattern and then it doesn't. Sela thought about every overnight nurse at Lenox Valley who had worked Regan's procedures and said nothing, or said something quietly to each other in the break room and then gone back to their shift, or written a note in a chart in careful clinical language that didn't quite say what they had actually observed because they'd learned not to say it directly. The accumulated quiet of people who have decided, for reasons that are entirely understandable, that speaking directly costs more than they can currently afford to pay. I know, she said again. She got into her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The parking lot was thinning shift change approaching, the day staff filtering out, the evening staff filtering in. The automatic doors of the main entrance cycled open and closed in the familiar rhythm. The facility's van was still parked at its angle near the service entrance. She thought about Nora Weld in western Pennsylvania, who had agreed to submit a declaration, who had agreed to submit a decline after 6 years of deciding it wasn't something she could do, who had said she didn't want someone else to have to sit in a room and watch her version of events get summarized into something that sounded like nobody's fault, who had been right 6 years ago and had carried being right 6 years ago like a weight that had no place to be set down, until now. Sela started the engine. She pulled out of the lot and drove toward her apartment, and she let herself feel briefly, and without performing it for anyone, the specific quality of a day that had gone the way this one had gone. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something more complicated than that, the feeling of something enormous having moved, and the understanding that enormous things, when they move, leave a great deal of work in their wake. She was 2 blocks from her apartment when her phone rang through the car's speaker system. Not Presley, not Ostroff, not Hartwell. The number was Lenox Valley Regional Medical Center. She answered. Ms. Vance. It was a voice she hadn't heard before, not administrative, not legal. Something quieter, a woman's voice. My name is Ruth Carver. I'm an OR nurse. Evening rotation. A pause. I heard about the hearing today. Word travels fast, Sela said. In a hospital it does, Carver said. I need to tell you something. I've needed to tell someone for a while, and I think today changed what I can do. She stopped. Started again. I worked Regan's rotation for 4 years. I stopped 8 months ago when I requested a reassignment. I told administration it was a scheduling preference. Another pause. Longer. It wasn't a scheduling preference. Sela pulled to the curb and stopped the car. I'm listening, she said. The retained instrument case, Carver said. The nurse who filed the anonymous complaint, I knew her. I was there that day. Not in the room, but after. She came out of that shift, and she told me what happened. She told me what she had said and what he had done. And another stop. The sound of someone doing the particular math of whether they are about to make a decision that changes something. I told her to file the anonymous report. I told her it was the safest way. A breath. And then I watched what happened to her schedule. And I said nothing more, because I had 4 years of working in that environment and I knew exactly what saying more cost. She paused. I have documentation. My own notes from conversations with her at the time. Kept them because I thought I don't know what I thought. Maybe I thought someday someone would ask. And nobody did. Until now. Sela sat at the curb with the engine running and the streetlights coming on in the early dark of October and the phone in her hand. Ruth, she said, do you have Gail Ostroff's contact information? No, Carver said. I'm going to text it to you in 2 minutes, Sela said. Call her tonight. Tell her exactly what you just told me. Don't leave anything out. Don't summarize it. Don't decide in advance what's relevant. Just tell her. A pause. Okay, Carver said. One more thing, Sela said. The documentation you kept. Where is it? At home, Carver said. Handwritten. In a notebook. She paused. I don't know if it counts for anything. Contemporaneous notes in your own handwriting from the period in question, Sela said. Counts. She ended the call and sat for a moment. Then she texted Ostroff's number to Carver's phone and sat for another moment before she pulled back into traffic. The notebook existed, which meant there was a witness who had been there from the beginning of the retained instrument case, not someone who had filed a complaint later, not someone working from archived records, but someone who had been present in the immediate aftermath, who had advised the anonymous complaint, who had watched what happened next, and who had kept contemporaneous notes that she had carried for 8 months and that had now found the place they were supposed to land. Which meant the retained instrument case was not an anonymous complaint about a closed event. It was a witnessed account with documentation. Which meant that when the State Medical Board opened its review of Callum Regan's Ohio surgical record, they were not going to be working from pattern inference alone. Sela got home and sent Ostroff a message summarizing the call with Carver and flagging the notebook. Then she stood in her kitchen and opened the refrigerator and looked at its contents, which were sufficient but uninspiring, and took out cheese and bread and ate standing at the counter because she had not eaten since 7:30, and her body was making that fact known. She was halfway through the second piece of bread when her phone rang again. Ostroff. Carver just called me, Ostroff said. She has 4 pages of handwritten notes from the night after the retained instrument case. Dates, times, what the nurse told her verbatim. what she advised. Pause. Celsa, the notes include a specific quote from Regan that the nurse reported to Carver directly. Quote from inside that OR, something he said when he was told about the instrument. Sela put the bread down. What did he say? Ostroff was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully level. According to the nurse, who reported it to Carver the same night, Regan said, "If she'd flagged it before I started closing, I might have listened." She waited too long. The kitchen was very quiet around Sela. He had known. In the moment he had known, the concern had been raised, and his response had not been that the concern was invalid. His response had been a judgment about timing. He had decided the window had passed, and he had closed, and then he had characterized the incident as a team communication failure, and Albright had reviewed his privileges knowing that account existed, and the nurse who had flagged it had watched her schedule collapse, and Ruth Carver had carried a notebook for 8 months because she hadn't known where else to put it. She was right. Someone had written in the Aldermore margin 6 years ago, and then they had crossed it out. Sela looked at the bread on the counter. She looked at the kitchen around her, the legal pad on the table, the pen beside it, the window with the October dark outside. She was tired in a way that was real and physical, and that she was not going to pretend wasn't there. Picked up the bread and finished it. Then she sat down at the table and opened the legal pad to a new page, because tomorrow was going to require a clear account of the Carver call and the quote and its implications, and she had learned the hard way that the distance between what you remember clearly and what you can prove clearly is exactly the width of a contemporaneous note, and she was not going to arrive at whatever came next without one. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she was done, she put the cap on the pen and looked at what she had written and read it back and made 2 corrections where her phrasing had been ambiguous. And then she put the pen down. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Presley sent to both her and Ostroff simultaneously. State Medical Board notified and reviewing for emergency interim action. Albright placed on administrative leave by hospital CEO pending external audit. Regan's scheduled surgeries for the next 2 weeks have been reassigned effective this evening. And then, below that, a second message from Presley, sent only to Sela. Nora Weld called me. She asked how the hearing went. I told her. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Tell the nurse I'm glad she didn't stop." Sela read that twice. She set the phone face down on the table and sat in her kitchen with the legal pad in front of her and the October dark outside her window, and she let herself have the feeling of that, not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more durable than either of those. The feeling of something that had been wrong for a long time beginning, in its slow and grinding and irreversible way, to be made right. Then her phone buzzed again. She turned it over. The number on the screen was not Presley, not Ostroff, not Hartwell. It was a number she did not recognize, with an area code she did not immediately place. She stared at it for a moment, and the call rang through to voicemail, and a moment later, the voicemail notification appeared. Played it. The voice was male, older, with the specific quality of a man who has chosen his words before he picked up the phone and is still not entirely sure they are the right ones. Ms. Vance, my name is Gerald Doyle. Marks Doyle is my brother. A pause. He told me what happened, what you did, what happened to you after. Another pause longer. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing medical law for 22 years. I don't have a dog in this fight. Professionally, I want to be clear about that. But I've been doing some reading today about Lenox Valley and about Callum Regan, and I found something in the public credentialing database that I don't think your team has seen yet. His voice shifted, careful, controlled, the voice of someone who knows the weight of what they're about to say. It's not Regan. It's about the hospital's malpractice insurance carrier. There's a filing in the public record that shouldn't be there, a notation in the carrier's database that suggests The retained instrument settlement 8 months ago was not the first time this carrier was asked to cover a Regan-related claim at this hospital. A pause. There's a prior claim, 18 months before the retained instrument case. It was settled privately, below the reporting threshold, which is why it didn't appear in the standard record to search. His voice went very still. Claimant in that case was the family of a patient. The surgical notes from that case list the attending as Regan, and the nursing documentation from that procedure. I've only seen a summary, but the summary references a nursing concern raised intraoperatively that was not addressed. One more pause. I thought you should know. Call me back when you're ready. The voicemail ended. Sela sat with the phone in her hand and looked at the legal pad in front of her, at the 40 minutes of careful notes she had just finished writing, at the pen lying beside it with its cap back on. She picked up the pen, took the cap off, and turned to the next page. She wrote for another hour that night. Gerald Doyle's voicemail went into the notes. First, the area code, the claim number he had referenced, the specific language he had used about the insurance carrier filing, the 18-month timeline, the detail about the nursing documentation summary. She wrote it all down before she called him back, because she had learned that the gap between hearing something and writing it down is where precision goes to die, and she was not losing precision at this stage. When she called him back at 10:40, he answered on the second ring. He was measured and specific in the way of someone who has spent 22 years building cases from documents, and he gave her what he had without editorializing, which she appreciated. Prior malpractice claim had been filed against the hospital, not Regan individually, which was standard practice, and which was also how institutions absorb liability in ways that don't leave visible marks on the surgeon involved. The settlement had been below the mandatory reporting threshold by $4,000, which, Gerald Doyle said, with the flat precision of a man who has seen this exact number before, was not an accident. Below threshold settlements don't appear in the public credentialing database, he said. They're designed not to, but the carrier's filing notation references the case internally, and that notation is accessible if you know which database to pull and what you're looking for. A pause. I know what I'm looking for because my brother almost died on that man's table. The nursing documentation summary, Sela said. Do you have access to the actual record? Not yet, he said. I have the summary from the carrier's internal case notes. Getting the original surgical record requires a formal request and probably a subpoena. But the summary references it clearly intraoperative nursing concern, not addressed, documented post-procedure by the scrub nurse. Send me everything you have, she said, tonight. And I'm going to give you Gail Ostroff's contact information. Call her first thing in the morning. She forwarded it all to Ostroff with a single line, third claim. Predates the retained instrument case by 18 months. Below reporting threshold, she did not add anything else, because Ostroff was capable of reading the implications without a guide. Then she put the phone down and sat at her kitchen table in the specific quiet of a person who has done everything that can be done in this moment and is now in the gap before the next thing opens. The legal pad in front of her had 3 pages of notes. Pen was in her hand. Outside the window, the October dark was complete and still. She thought about what 3 claims meant. Not in the legal sense, she understood that clearly enough. In the human sense, 3 separate moments, across an undetermined timeline, in which someone in an operating room had raised a concern and had not been heard, and in which a patient had paid a price that ranged from a second surgery to a death, and in which the institution around those moments had processed the cost in the quietest available way and moved forward. 3 moments that had existed in separate files, in separate systems, in separate states, none of them visible to any of the others, until a nurse who saved a man's life was suspended fast enough to catch the attention of a federal investigator, and the investigator started pulling threads, and the threads turned out to be connected to the same fabric. closed the legal pad. She went to bed. She slept 5 hours, which was not enough and was what was available. The board determination did not take 5 business days. Took 2. Ostroff called at 8:17 on a Thursday morning, and her voice had the particular quality of someone delivering news they have been waiting to deliver. Official determination came through an hour ago, she said. Suspension rescinded. The board's language is direct. The determination states that Vance's actions were consistent with her clinical assessment, that her assessment was medically sound and supported by subsequent surgical findings, and that her removal from the OR and subsequent suspension were not supported by the clinical record of the event. A pause. They used the phrase inaccurate characterization, which is board language for the incident report was wrong. Sela was standing in her kitchen with her coffee. And Regan? Surgical privileges suspended pending independent review of his complete case record at Lenox Valley, Ostroff said. The state medical board issued the emergency interim action yesterday afternoon. His Ohio license is inactive while the review is underway. He does not operate in this state until further notice. Another pause. Albright resigned this morning. Hospital announced it as mutual agreement, effective immediately. External credentialing audit was already underway. Howell brought in an outside firm 48 hours ago. Albright leaving doesn't stop the audit. It shouldn't, Sela said. It won't, Ostroff confirmed. The audit has its own mandate now. His resignation doesn't close anything it opened. She paused. Howell issued a formal institutional apology to you. It's in the determination letter, in writing, on hospital letterhead, with her signature. Sela put the coffee down. She had not expected that, not the apology itself, but the speed of it, the decision to put it in the formal determination rather than delivering it separately in a way that could be characterized as procedural rather than genuine. Howell had made a choice about how to do this, and the choice she made said something about the kind of administrator she was when she understood what she was actually looking at. The letter also states it, Ostroff said, that the disciplinary records of the 2 nurses up from the prior incidents have been reviewed and will be formally corrected. The pharmacy audit finding that validated the first nurse's medication concern is being entered into the official record. Performance improvement plan on the second nurse's file is being rescinded. A pause. They can't undo what those women went through, but their personnel records are going to say what actually happened. Sela was quiet for a moment. What about the anonymous complaint nurse? The retained instrument case? SAPS is handling that personally, Ostroff said. She's been identified through the scheduling records. Her name is Diane Forsyth. She's been contacted. She agreed to a formal meeting with SAP and hospital HR next week. A pause. She cried when they called her. According to SAP, she said she had been waiting 8 months for someone to tell her that filing the complaint had mattered. Sela stood in her kitchen and held the phone and did not say anything for a moment. You still there? Ostroff said. Yes, Sela said. I'm here. There's one more thing, Ostroff said. Regan's prior claim, Gerald Doyle's information. I submitted it to both the State Board and Presley's office last night. The State's Board has formally requested the original surgical record from the prior case. They're treating the 3 claims as a connected pattern now. That changes the scope of the investigation significantly. She paused. Family of the patient in the prior claim has been notified that the case is being reviewed. They were told only that new information has come to light. They haven't been told the extent of it yet. They will be, Sela said. They will be, Ostroff agreed. After the call, Sela went and sat at her kitchen table and looked out the window at the Thursday morning. The day had the quality that November days in Ohio have when they're not yet committing to winter gray and still and functional. Not beautiful, but honest. She sat with her coffee, and she let the determinations settle into the correct place, which took longer than the announcement of it, because the announcement is the moment, and the settling is the actual thing. She thought about the 17 months she had spent at Lenox Valley in Navy scrubs, moving through shifts in the particular invisibility of someone who has been correctly identified by an institution as background. She had let it happen, which she could be honest about. Not because she was passive, but because she had arrived already carrying the habit of making herself smaller in civilian spaces, the persistent adjustment of a person who had spent 6 years in environments where her skills were entirely legible and had then entered one where they weren't, and had accommodated that illegibility rather than correcting it. She had decided, somewhere in that first year, that the work was enough and the recognition was optional. The work had not been enough. Not because she needed credit, but because when the work requires visibility to function, the clinical context demands that your assessment be heard, and not just performed in visibility becomes its own kind of failure. She had known what she saw in that ultrasound image. She had communicated it, and then she had let it stop there at the doorway, because pushing further than that had seemed like more than she was authorized to do. She was never going to miscalibrate that again. The independent review of Regan's surgical record at Lenox Valley took 11 weeks. Sela was not involved in it directly. It was conducted by an outside clinical audit firm, but contracted by the hospital with oversight from the state medical board. But Presley kept her informed of the broad shape of what was found because Sela's formal testimony was part of the investigative record, and Presley had an obligation to close that loop. The review identified 11 cases in which nursing or resident concerns had been documented and not acted upon. 3 of those cases involved substandard care determinations outcomes that fell below the accepted standard given the information available at the time of the procedure. One was formally referred to the state medical board for additional action beyond the pending license review. When the board issued its findings, they were public, not buried in a settlement agreement with a confidentiality provision, not characterized as a team communication failure and filed away in an administrative system that nobody would look at until something went wrong enough to make looking unavoidable. Public on the state medical board's website in the specific format of a formal professional reprimand, Callum Regan's full name, the findings, the 2-year mandatory oversight requirement, the permanent notation in his professional record. Permanent. Not a flag for follow-up. Not pending confirmation. Permanent. Sela read it on a Tuesday afternoon in her apartment, at the same kitchen table where she had written 4 pages of notes the night of the board hearing. She read the whole document, front to back. With the same quality of attention she gave anything that contained consequential detail. When she finished, she sat for a moment, and then she closed her laptop and went for a run, 4 miles through streets that had gone from October cold to November cold while she wasn't paying attention, and she ran without music because she didn't need it today. Warren Albright did not avoid consequences by resigning. The external credentialing audit produced a finding of deliberate non-disclosure. The specific language was material omission in the credentialing review process, and the finding was referred to the Ohio Attorney General's office, which opened a formal inquiry. The inquiry was ongoing, and its outcome was not guaranteed, because these things move slowly, and the law around institutional credentialing accountability is neither simple nor friendly to swift resolution. But it was open. It was on the record. It was not going to close quietly. Nora Weld's declaration was entered into the state medical board's formal proceeding against Regan's license. Her name appeared in the public record of that proceeding, which meant she had no anonymity in it, but she had chosen that finally, after 6 years of carrying the alternative. Presley told Sela that Weld had called the day the board issued its findings and said only that she was glad it was written down somewhere that couldn't be crossed out. Ruth Carver's notebook, 4 handwritten pages from 8 months ago, contemporaneous notes from the night after the retained instrument case, became part of the evidence record for the state board's review. Quote she had recorded The one Regan had said inside that OR about timing and listening was entered formally into the proceeding. It did not appear in the public finding by name, but it was in the record, and the people who needed to know it was there knew it was there. Diane Forsyth, the nurse who had filed the anonymous retained instrument complaint and watched her schedule cut by 2/3, met with SAP and hospital HR, and then met again with the hospital's new interim surgical director, a woman named Dr. Pauline Ackert, who had been brought in during the administrative reorganization that followed Albright's resignation. Forsyth was offered a return to her prior rotation. She didn't take it. She had built something in her current assignment that she was not ready to dismantle, but she asked for something different, which was a formal acknowledgement in her personnel file that the schedule reduction had been retaliatory and that the complaint she filed had been clinically valid. She got it, in writing, signed. The prior claim family, the ones Gerald Doyle had found, were contacted by the hospital's patient relations office. Conversation was difficult and incomplete in the way these conversations always are, because there is no document that gives back what a patient death takes. But the review of their case was genuine, and the hospital's formal acknowledgement that the nursing documentation from that procedure had been overlooked in the original case assessment was real, and the additional settlement process that followed was not the $4,000 below threshold kind. It was the kind that requires a table and attorneys on both sides and the particular honesty of an institution that has decided to stop optimizing for the cost of accountability. Sela was not present for any of that. She knew the outlines of it through Ostroff and Presley, but she was not central to it, which was correct. The people who were central to it were the ones who had been harmed, and the work of addressing that harm belonged to them and to the institutions that had failed them. Sela's role in that story was the thread that had pulled the others loose, not the whole fabric. She had her own things to figure out. Hartwell called in the 3rd week of November. His voice had the particular quality it got when he had a concrete offer and was deciding how to lead with it. She had learned to recognize the difference between Hartwell thinking out loud and Hartwell building toward something. And this was the second kind. There's a program, he said, joint development, civilian and military trauma training focus. Concept has been in development for 18 months. The idea is to create a bridge curriculum that trains civilian nurses in forward surgical assessment techniques and cross-trains military medics in hospital procedural environments. A pause. We've been looking for someone to run the nursing curriculum, someone who has operated in both spaces and understands the gap between them from the inside. Sela said nothing. She was listening. It's not a position that exists yet in a fully formalized way, Hartwell said. It's a build, which means you'd be building it. The curriculum, the training protocols, the assessment criteria. There's a facility, a training center, attached to a civilian hospital with a partnership arrangement with the Army Medical Center in the region. It's in Virginia. A pause. I know you're aware of the considerations. How long do I have to decide, she said. A week, he said, which I know is not a lot of time. But the program needs to move, and you're the right person, and I'd rather have you decide in a week than have someone less right decide in a month. She thought about it for the full week. Not agonized, thinking he was not someone who agonized, but real consideration, because the decision was real and deserved that. She thought about what she was and was not walking back in too. She thought about the difference between a training context and a clinical one, and whether the thing she was best at was better deployed in one versus the other. She thought about the nurses who had been quiet in rooms where Ragan operated, the ones who had learned through experience that the cost of speaking was too high, and she thought about what it would mean to train the next generation of clinical staff in environments where they were given the language and the framework and the specific confidence to say what they saw without, waiting for permission that was never going to come. She thought about Nora Weld and Diane Forsyth and the unnamed nurse at Aldermore, who had been right and who had needed someone to tell her that 6 years before anyone did. Called Hartwell on day 6. Yes, she said. A pause that contained something she didn't usually hear in Hartwell's voice, something warmer than his professional register. Good, he said. She gave her notice to Ostroff, who was not representing her in an ongoing capacity at that point, but who she called out of courtesy, because Ostroff had been her advocate when she needed one, and that deserved acknowledgement. Closed out her apartment lease with the particular efficiency of someone who has moved before and knows which tasks actually matter and which ones just feel like they do. Packed in a weekend. Before she left Lenox Valley, the city, not the hospital, which she had not set foot in since the hearing, she drove to the address she had for Marcus Doyle. She had gotten it from Gerald Doyle, who had passed it on with his brother's permission. She didn't know why she was going until she was already in the car and halfway there, and then she did know, and the reason was simple and human enough that she stopped trying to articulate it more precisely than that. He lived in a house on a residential street 20 minutes from the hospital, with a driveway that held a truck and a smaller car and 2 bikes leaning against the garage in a way that suggested they were used regularly. She knocked. His wife answered, a woman in her 40s with the specific expression of someone who has recently experienced a very close thing and is still carrying the residue of it. And then Marcus Doyle appeared from somewhere behind her, moving carefully, the movement of a man whose body is recovered, but still remembering what it went through. He was bigger than she remembered, which meant her memory had compressed him into the smaller version that people become when they are horizontal and critical. Standing, he had the build of someone who had spent 30 years on job sites, broad, solid, not a man who would have considered himself fragile before the night that proved everyone fragile. He looked at her for a moment. "I know who you are," he said. "I know," she said. He opened the door wider. "Come in." 40 minutes. His wife made coffee that she didn't need, but accepted because declining felt like the wrong register for the room. Doyle's recovery was on track. There would be follow-up imaging, a dietary period, a return to work that his wife had opinions about, and he had different opinions about, and the specific negotiation of 2 people who have both been through something and come out with different sets of residual fears. He was not effusive. He was not the kind of man who made speeches. But he sat across from her at his kitchen table and looked at her with the direct, unadorned gratitude of someone who has decided not to dress it up. "My brother told me what you've been through," he said. After. "He's been helpful," Sela said. "He's a pain in the ass most of the time," Doyles said. "But he knows what to do with the situation." He looked at her. "You saved my life." She looked back at him. There was a version of this conversation where she deflected that, where she described the technical circumstances in a way that distributed the credit or reframed her role or made it something smaller than what it was. She had done that version of the conversation with herself many times in the past several weeks. "Yes," she said, "I did." He nodded, like that was the right answer. Like he had wanted her to be able to say it plainly. "Thank you," he said. She drove back to her apartment and finished packing. She loaded her car the next morning and left the city at 7:15 before the morning traffic committed to itself. The drive to Virginia was 6.5 hours with 1 stop, and she spent most of it in the particular quiet of someone who is in motion between one thing and another, which is its own kind of state, not the ending and not the beginning, just the distance between them. Training facility was attached to Hargrove Memorial Hospital in a mid-sized city in Northern Virginia. It had been retrofitted from a conference wing, not glamorous, functional, with the specific unfinished quality of a space that is still becoming what it is supposed to be. Hartwell was there when she arrived, along with a program administrator named Karen Song, who had been managing the development logistics, and who had the organized intensity of someone who has been waiting for the curriculum person to show up so the actual work can begin. The office that would be Sela's was small and had a window that faced a parking structure, which was fine. She had worked in worse sight lines than a parking structure. The desk had been ordered, but not yet arrived, which was also fine. She set her bag on the floor and looked at the empty room and thought about what it was going to hold. The curriculum took 4 months to build. Not 4 months of Sela sitting alone and writing modules, 4 months of collaborative, sometimes contentious, frequently exhausting work with a team that included 2 Army Medical Center training officers, a trauma nurse educator from Hargrove, and a former flight medic named Drew Pacheco, who had opinions about every proposed framework and was correct about approximately 60% of them, which was actually to make his high enough to make his disagreements worth the time they took. The central problem they were solving was one that Sela understood from both sides. The gap between what civilian nurses are trained to do and what forward-deployed medics are trained to do is not a skills gap so much as a context gap. Skills overlap considerably. What doesn't overlap is the framework for applying them under pressure, the difference between a protocol-based environment and an environment where the protocol is not available and you are the available resource. And what happens to clinical judgment when you cross from one to the other. Civilian nurses trained in the first often freeze in the second. Military medics trained in the second often struggle with the institutional structure of the first. Curriculum Sela built was designed to narrow that gap, to give civilian nurses enough experience with high pressure, low resource decision-making that they didn't lose their clinical judgment when the environment stripped their scaffolding away, and to give military medics enough hospital, procedural context, that the transition to civilian practice didn't cost them the instincts they had spent years developing. The first cohort was 15 nurses, 8 medics, 3 residents who had volunteered for the supplemental training. They were not a uniform group, different levels of experience, different institutional backgrounds, different levels of comfort with the structured discomfort that the training required. The first 2 days were rough, in the specific way that beginnings are rough when people don't yet trust the framework they've been handed. On the 3rd day, Sela ran the displaced anatomy scenario. It was not the scenario she had planned to run on day 3, but something in the cohort's interaction during the 2nd day told her they were ready for it, sooner than the schedule suggested, and she had learned to trust that kind of red. She set up the simulation, a patient presenting with an injury mechanism that produced anatomical displacement, a portable ultrasound image with the vessel in the non-standard position, an attending surgeon avatar in the scenario who responded to nursing input with controlled dismissal. She ran the cohort through it in pairs, 1 nurse, 1 medic, working the scenario together. She watched what happened. What happened, consistently, across every pair, was the same thing that had happened to the nurses in Regan's OR. The nursing participant flagged the displacement, received the dismissal, and stopped. Retreated. Recalibrated their assessment downward to match the authorities' response, the Datsens, rather than upward to match the evidence. Stopped the room after the 3rd pair. "Tell me what just happened," she said. A nurse named Terry, who was 2nd year from a hospital in Maryland and had been one of the more confident participants in the first 2 days, said, "I backed off." Why? Terry looked at the simulation setup. "Because he said I was wrong." "Was the image wrong?" Sela said. "No." "Was your read of the image wrong?" "No." "So what backed you off?" Sela said. Terry was quiet for a moment. Around the room, the other participants were doing the particular quiet of people who recognize themselves in someone else's answer. "The authority," she said finally. "He has the authority, and I don't." Sela looked at her. "He has the authority to make the surgical decision," she said. "He does not have the authority to determine what the image shows." Those are different things. One of them is his domain. One of them is yours. She looked at the room. The moment you let someone else's authority override your own direct clinical observation, you are not being humble. You are being absent, and absent nurses get patients killed. The room held that. She had not planned to say it that bluntly on day 3. But it was true, and it was the thing that needed to be said before anything else in the curriculum made its full sense, and she was no longer in the business of calibrating truth to what the room was ready to hear. She ran the scenario again. This time she told them, "Your observation is yours. Say it once, clearly, and put it in the record. Say it again if the circumstances change. Don't dress it up and don't apologize for it. If it's dismissed, document the dismissal. The patient deteriorates in the way your observation predicted. Act on that deterioration with everything you have. But do not, in the moment between your observation and the authorities' response, abandon your own read of what you saw." The fourth pair ran the scenario. The nurse flagged the displacement. The simulator dismissed it. She flagged it again, cleaner this time, with the specific certainty of someone who has decided the second delivery is going to be the complete version. The medics beside her backed her up immediately, without being asked. The simulator dismissed them both. The nurse said, "I'm documenting this concern in the patient record right now." Sela said, "Stop the scenario." She looked at the nurse, a woman named Alicia, who had been quiet for the first 2 days, and who had apparently been accumulating something during that quiet. "What did you just do?" she said. "I put it on the record," Alicia said, "so that if something goes wrong, there's documentation that the concern was raised." "Yes," Sela said. "And what else?" Alicia thought about it. "I made it harder to characterize as a team communication failure," she said. The room was quiet. "Yes," Sela said. "Exactly that." The program ran its first full cycle over 12 weeks. The exit evaluations were not uniformly strong. A training program that produced uniformly strong exit evaluations is a training program that isn't testing hard enough, but the specific skill set the curriculum was designed to develop, since Sela had built the whole framework around, showed measurable improvement across the cohort in every assessment category they had designed to measure it. Hartwell attended the final session of the first cycle. He sat in the back of the room and did not introduce himself to the participants, which was his choice and which Sela respected. After the session, he found her in the hallway. "It works," he said. "Some of it," she said. "There are 3 modules I'm rebuilding for the second cycle. The medic-to-hospital transition section is too theoretical. It needs more simulation and less framework lecture." He looked at her with the expression she remembered from her second deployment, the look of a man who has assessed something and arrived at a conclusion he considers complete. "It works," he said again. She didn't argue with him. Her commendation was formally restored in December, 4 months after the board hearing. Paperwork came through Hartwell's office in the specific form of a corrected service record, the original recommendation, retroactively processed, with the combat medical commendation and the trauma qualification notation added to her official file. There was no ceremony. The Army does not typically hold ceremonies for administrative corrections. Hartwell mailed her a copy of the corrected record with a note that said only it was always true. Now the file says so. She put it in a folder in her desk drawer. Not on the wall, in the drawer where she could find it when she needed to find it and didn't need to look at it the rest of the time. She ran into Ostroff at a medical law conference in February that Ostroff was presenting at and that Sela attended as part of a panel on clinical safety reporting systems. They had coffee afterward in the conference hotel lobby, not as attorney and client, just as 2 people who had been through something together. "The Attorney General's office is still investigating Albright," Ostroff said. "It's slow. These things are slow, but it's moving." "I know," Sela said. "Presley keeps me updated. Regan's license review is expected to conclude in the spring," Ostroff said. 2-year oversight is the minimum. Based on the scope of the independent review findings, there's an argument for something more significant. She paused. "His attorney has been quiet since January. That's usually either a good sign or a very bad sign, and in this context, I think it's the former. Family from the prior claim, Sela said. Settlement finalized in January, Ostroff said. I can't tell you the number, but it was not below the reporting threshold. Sela nodded. They sat for a moment in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have said the main things and don't need to fill what's left. You seem different, Ostroff said. In what way? Ostroff looked at her. Less compressed, she said. Sela considered that. It was accurate, she thought. She was less compressed. Not because the things that had made her compressed were gone the years of making herself smaller, the habit of calibrating her presence to what the room would accept, specific cost of operating in environments that didn't have a framework for what she was, but because she was no longer doing those things, and the absence of them had given her back some volume she hadn't realized she'd lost. She was not a different person than she had been in Bay 3 on that October night, standing in the doorway in navy scrubs while Regan ignored her. She was the same person, the same skills, the same observations, the same read of a displaced artery on a portable ultrasound screen. What was different was that she was no longer letting the room's willingness to hear her determine whether the thing she had to say was worth saying. That was a small adjustment with a large radius. In March, she got a message through the program's general contact channel from a nurse at a hospital in Cincinnati who had heard about the Lenox Valley case through professional circles and who had a question about how to document a clinical concern she had raised that had been dismissed. The message was careful and specific, the message of someone who has been in a situation and doesn't quite know what the right move is. Sela wrote back the same day. She wrote a full response, not a form answer, a real one that addressed the specific documentation language, the institutional process, and the specific distinction between what the nurse was authorized to observe and what the surgeon was authorized to decide. She told her that her observation was hers, and nobody's authority could reassign it. Told her to say it clearly, put it in the record, and say it again if the circumstances required. Then she said, "You saw what you saw. That doesn't require anyone's permission to be true." She sent the message and went back to the curriculum she was rebuilding for the second cohort, the medic-to-hospital transition modules, the ones that needed more simulation and less theory, the ones that would teach the next group of people coming through her room how to carry what they knew into spaces that didn't automatically recognize it. She had spent years in rooms that didn't recognize what she was. She knew exactly how to build a door in a wall like that. She was going to keep building them until the wall was mostly doors. That was the work. Not clean, not finished, not arriving at a moment where everything was resolved. And the people who caused harm had been fully accounted for, and the people who were harmed had been fully restored. The work was messier than that and longer than that, and it required people who understood that the point is not the moment when you're finally vindicated. Point is what you do with what you know, in the room you're standing in, with the information you actually have. Sela Vance had spent 6 years learning how to keep people alive in rooms that most people never had to be in. She had spent 17 months being invisible in a room that should have seen her. She had spent one night refusing to be invisible when a man's life made refusing the only available option. And now she spent her days teaching people to do the same, not the specific act, not the exact scenario, but the underlying thing, the thing beneath all of it, the willingness to trust what you see and say it clearly and not let dismissal determine whether it was ever worth saying. It was not a comfortable life, exactly. She did not think comfortable had ever been quite the right word for what she was built for. But she was finally, completely, exactly where her skills belonged. And she was not making herself smaller for anyone.